It was a beautiful sunny day outside, the kind of day one could only dream of, but it would have been better if it had never existed. There was chaos all around. Trees were being uprooted from the ground. People were flying off like gnats from the violent blows. A huge shadow was already looming over the beautiful unconscious woman, the owner of which had caused such devastation and mass fright of the locals. A large furry hand picked up the girl, encompassing her completely, like a child with a small doll. A horrible monster with sharp, scary teeth and wild, glowing eyes that could only be seen in horror movies. He headed onward, not even noticing how he was trampling people. Outside the walls of the city, since the apocalypse began, the people had no way to bury the fallen warriors, and now, the hard foot of one of them stepped against the monster. The horned beast had spotted the new prey at his back, and was ready to crush him into a wet slick and mold of skin and organs as well. It was a guy with the look of no danger. Behind his back was a huge crate. He didn't expect to encounter a demonic beast here, but there was no worrying at all visible on him. Now they were left alone, and the heart sank in his chest from not knowing what would happen next. Only hope that everything will end well for the man. The guy was one of the delivery men after the apocalypse. Suddenly, the brown-haired man noticed a very familiar symbol with an unknown animal or insect on its shoulder, and now his gaze grew serious. The girl in her arms started to come to her senses. She heard that there was someone here, and the guy didn't expect there was anyone left alive. The victim lifted her head and tried to lean on her fist with her hands, which clenched her heart and pressed everything inside. She realized that this was the courier. It was hard to breathe and perceive information too. The guy was indeed a member of that profession. Her name is Lu Renjia, a black iron level courier. And the main thing for the woman to do was to still hold on a little longer and hold out until he rescued her. The girl, once she heard that he was from the black iron rank, resigned herself to her fate and ordered her interlocutor to run away from here as fast as possible, or else she would suffer herself. This monster is no match for the hero, and the proof was the pile of dead people on the ground who also wanted to escape, but didn't manage to get their feet away from the bony death. The victim Outa realized what awaited her and asked the guy to just forget about her and save his life by fleeing. Don't even try. It would be better if at least someone left here alive. The monster had already brought the girl up to several rows of teeth, but the guy couldn't afford such behavior. In one easy jerk he settled on the horned beast's shoulder, which the guy didn't notice. One uncomplicated movement, and the arm at the elbow of this terrible monster was severed. Now the scream of the enemy echoed through the valley, pain spreading throughout his body. He began to panic and run, and the guy was ruthless in appearance, but managed to pull his victim from the monster's clutches and held him in his arms. A confident smile of triumph and power appeared on his face. He said he shouldn't have been so worried. The courier put the woman on the floor, and behind his back the armless monster was already flying at them to avenge his pain and would no longer just kill, but intended to brutally maim and torture the people in front of him. Bright sparks began to emanate from him, as sharp as his gaze, warning that he was ready to fight back. Immediately that energy traveled through his body and crept into his very pupils. He became lightning himself, an attack as fast and outshining everyone else. Once and the smoke dispersed in rosy directions, overriding what the guy had done to the behemoth smashed into ash. As the ground fell from the air from such a blow, Lu Renjia finally completed his sentence about not worrying about it by saying that he was the strongest black iron level courier. Guy asked the rescued girl to hold on a little longer. He would get her immediately to a place where she would be taken care of. Dust and debris from the ground was still settling around, but the victim waited so not to rush and do nothing to her yet. We still need to help her younger sister, and she believes she is still alive somewhere. Lu Renjia did not expect that there is also a younger sister. Now the matter was more complicated. In addition to rescue, you need to search for the child in the middle of not very familiar terrain full of monsters. But safer must be saved. Little girl feet stomped through the grass, shuddering a little at her. The girl was now trying to catch her breath, was somewhere in the middle of the bushes, carrying a box with her, and the monsters were following her. And her life must be preserved by all means. The girl's younger sister, who had been pulled from the monster's clutches, was the last hope of their village. The girl ran down the path, breathing hard. She couldn't stop, but it was hard to keep going. After looking around, I decided to rest, so after making sure it was more or less safe, I slowed down my pace. But suddenly, there was a loud rustling sound from behind, which was very distinctive against the background of the calm and quiet forest. The girl's eyes widened as she looked in the direction of the unexpected sound. There was a very tall and large monster standing there. She couldn't have guessed that it would catch up to her so quickly, and she would have to gather her strength in her fist again to get her feet away. The girl moved forward, not realizing what to do now. Now there was no chance at all. Because of such thoughts, she didn't look forward and didn't notice that someone was already standing in front of her. And when she turned around, she was very frightened. Her heart almost jumped out of her chest. The guy apologized for such a fright and worrying and asked again if the lady in front of him was Li Xianxianyu. But there was no time to hear the answer. The girl tripped over something in the ground and was already flying towards Lu Renjia. The situation was awkward to no end. The box fell out of his hands, and Xianxian was already in the arms of a young but making great strides as a courier. The box even flew off a decent distance, and the two people who had crossed paths flipped over from the fact that neither managed to stay on their feet. The only thing that could have been worse was that the girl found herself sitting right on the face of a stranger encountered in the woods, and Lu Renjia found himself right between the legs of the one he was supposed to save. This is an incredibly horrible situation. Shame ran through his blood and expressed with red cheeks. The girl realized what was going on and blushed with embarrassment. It had not been planned at all. Xianxian bounced up and swung her own box, which she quickly fumbled for not as far away from herself as it turned out to be. And then bam! The thing touched right on the face of the strange guy who had just been between the girl's thighs. All embarrassed, he squirmed and only now decided to ask about who the random person was that she had come across in such a dangerous place. Lu Renjia, with a box in his head, introduced himself and explained that he was a courier from Tianfu City, and the girl was pissed off that this character talked as if nothing like this had just happened. But Xianxian was a little relieved that Lu Renjia was a courier and not an enemy who could harm her as well. She wanted to tell her that a monster was chasing her, but she didn't have time to finish because the guy noticed a tree flying at them, ripped from the ground. So immediately, the energy that flowed through Lu Renjia's veins exploded around and white smoke showed. When the smoke cleared, the two men were no longer there. One would have thought they were no longer alive, but it wasn't like that. The guy carried Xianxian on his back and talked over what he now realized what the girl wanted to say about being chased by a demonic beast. But then this monster caught up with them, or rather overtook them, and stood opposite. Now the girl began to panic even more. She did not understand what to do, but only because of ignorance about who exactly now with her in the team, and worrying. In fact, there was nothing to worrying about. The guy was not only pressured by the atmosphere, but also by the girl's chest, which clutched right into Lu Renjia's head and prevented him from taking even a breath of air. As soon as he spoke about not worrying about anything simply because he was here, he immediately heard a gunshot and a bullet whizzing by nearby. The guy hadn't expected that, so he turned around to see what had just happened in the first place, and whether it was now worth thinking about another danger behind him. But they were distracted from that by the scream of the hell beast, which shrieked in pain, because the attack came right on the eye, from which now the blood was gushing, and now they could breathe a little from the fact that the guys at least will not be tracked. Therefore, without much haste, Lu Renjia and Xianxian looked at the one who was their savior. A motorcycle with a sidecar was rushing at them, and a silhouette that stood right between one part of the apparatus and the other. It was a guy with glasses and a gleaming revolver in his hands who fired one bullet after another a couple seconds apart. He wasn't distracted by the people in front of him. The only target was the monster in front. The monster grabbed the spot where the eye used to be and began to back away as clumsily as possible from the fact that it had lost its balance, letting out a snarl of misery. But he didn't have time to come to his senses. Another shot followed, causing blood to spurt from his blood vessels and from under his skin. Xianxian yelled from fear and nerves, and the guy didn't really care much. Only he didn't understand why he was the one who was so angry at them. The guy on the motorcycle was yelling at the couple to move back. He himself was stubbornly riding straight into the monster and pointing his weapon at it, using it without a backwards thought about anything. Lu Renjia only noticed how the wheel of transport flashed past them, which just the girl in his arms could not observe normally, because from the excessive fear and adrenaline stuck her face into the shoulders of her savior and squeezed her eyes shut. The unfamiliar hero wordlessly pushed off his iron horse with his foe and rose into the air, and immediately began to shoot at the enemy without stopping, not even giving time to feel the full pain of one wound. inflicting another. But then an unpleasant click was heard from the revolver, which signified that the drum was completely empty. But this was not a problem for the stranger in glasses. While the infernal beast was screaming in pain, the guy had already filled the clip with another batch. Knowing where he was going, he had more than one batch of lead with him. And again the sounds of gunshots and hits to different parts of the huge monster's body. It looked more than epic, as if in some unrealistic action movie. The bullets kept hitting the enemy's head, creating a lot of pressure inside the big guy. There was what seemed to be the monster's last scream from the open, intimidating jaws on its head. As the man who had saved the two young men from death landed pathetically, the hellbeast's head exploded into small pieces, scattering drops of blood and remnants of organs around. The hero's shoes landed firmly with himself on the ground, kicking up a small amount of dust. He sat down on his faithful helper, a motorcycle, and asked if Lu Renjia and Xian were injured from such a collision, and then including his charm and skill with words, the stranger said that the charming young lady was as delicate as a flower, and if she has even one scratch on her, he can't sleep well. After saying that, he seemed to glow in her eyes like a prince from the Skozak. Now it was possible to see him better. He had piercings in his ears and images of crosses on his high collar. Xian immediately melted and almost stammered and replied that she was fine. Lu Renjia only sighed heavily. He had heard such words a lot of other girls and was amazed that this cheap trick with the skill of speech worked this time. The girl went up to the guy who had rescued them and suggested that he was also a courier, and then added her own seductive words about how the stranger had done such a great job. Grabbing his hand, she immediately began to flirt and admire the fact that the hero managed to kill the demonic beast in just a couple of shots. The same embarrassed to say that Xian just flattered him, and it was the most ordinary monster-esque glass. But Lu Renjia did not like everything that was happening. He did not hear a drop of praise, although he could also kill the enemy. This suddenly struck the motorcyclist as well, introducing himself as Sinan, the white-silver courier, and then wanting to know the rank of the interlocutor as well. Lu Renjia showed his chevron and with childlike joy put on the sheet that he was also a courier. Xian couldn't believe such self-confidence. After all, the kid in front of him had a black iron-level courier emblem, and it was completely hopeless in a situation like this. Except Xian knew absolutely nothing about it, so she asked what this rank meant. The savior smirked and with a slight chuckle began to explain about the general classification. There are 6 levels in total: black iron, bronze, white silver, gold, platinum and diamond. The level of couriers corresponds to the level of demonic beasts. Each courier can only defeat a demonic beast of the same level as himself. And this monster had a C-class level. How dare a black iron level courier claim that he could defeat this monster? So if Xian hadn't helped the guys, both of them would have died long ago. Lu Renjia took the girl with him and replied that another courier could take the body of the beast and get his reward, not intending to hear his humiliation. And Xian became indignant that the guys couldn't wait for the guy to finish telling. Although Xian wanted to stay with her savior, she was more concerned that her traveling companion knew her name even though they didn't know each other. That was the question of how. Lu Renjia had completely forgotten that he had forgotten to tell how he could know the girl's name, so this misunderstanding needed to be undone as quickly as possible. Because of that, immediately something iron clinked and fell from the courier's hands into Xian's hands. It was the girl's older sister's item, and she was just shocked at this item ended up in Lu Renjia's pocket, to which the answer was the story that she said Xian needed to deliver the necessary medicine to the village, and the older sister instructed the Wo to protect her. But then the girl interrupted her partner and interjected what she had heard, hoping she would hear words that would soothe her soul. Lu Renjia expressed his regrets about what happened and his sister due to the severe injury and lack of time to go to save Xian and her sister's life. All around, the wind rustled in the branches and leaves. The monster lay dead on the ground, and to top it all off, the sounds of whining had begun. Xian collapsed to her knees and could not accept such news. Xian tried to comfort her by saying that the dead could not be brought back to life, but afterwards expressed his condolences for the loss of the girl. Only as it turned out, those two got it wrong, because that's not what Lu Renjia had in mind at all. After all, he had taken her sister to the nearest camp because she was badly wounded, and apologized for not being able to save her in time, but he was in no hurry to reveal the whole truth, simply because he wasn't sure if she would survive after such a thing. Only said that Sister Xian had instructed him to protect the girl until she delivered the necessary medicines to her village and had already even received a reward for it. Twirling some object in his hands, Shinon recognized the item in this courier's hands and was surprised. After the very disaster that was absolutely horrific and ruined more than one life around him, all living creatures on Earth had undergone an unknown mutation and turned into demonic beasts. And now the most harmless animals could kill humans. And to be able to resist these monsters, mankind, with the help of not 1 month of immense labor and experimentation, managed to develop a way to obtain an unusual power. This preparation consisted of every possible microorganism and cell. And that drug was now in the hands of Lu Renjia. It's called the essence of genetic evolution. The Black Iron hero was surprised that their new acquaintance was also aware of what it was. Their conversation was interrupted by Xian, who concluded in tears that her sister had indeed died because this drug was her dowry. Shinon couldn't leave the lady in such a state, so he kept quiet for a split second and looked in her direction, after which he threw his cloak over her to calm the girl down a bit, and the girl's mouth quivered slightly at such a gesture. Guy made the point that since bringing supplies to her town was her sister's last will, it could be assumed that she should do what she could to fulfill her wish. In this way the guy supported the girl and made her keep her nose up so that she wouldn't get discouraged and think about such a serious loss. Lu Renjia interrupted such a touching moment, noting that it was indeed well said, but it was already time for them to move onward on their journey, and his interlocutor asked to wait a little longer. Xinyan turned to Miss Xian, saying that he didn't know why she was so unlucky to meet a demonic beast, but she needs to be much more careful. These monsters in the area are far from weak, and she might encounter a C-class beast again, and wanted to say that a Black Iron level courier wouldn't be able to handle them. As Lu Renjia, tossing the drug in his hand, asked him to stop talking in riddles and tell me directly what he was getting at. The guy with glasses only replied that Miss Xian had just experienced the loss of her sister, and moreover, was in great danger and he was just worried about her. However, in the southwestern border, she would hardly meet another white-silver level courier, so his suggestion is very simple. Would she like to choose Sinan as her escort? Well, of course the girl was willing to do so, and couldn't believe that she could really continue her journey with this particular person. But it was a well-planned plan, and now the hero has moved on to pay for his deed, and as such wants one thing. He offered to give him the genetic evolution essence, to which Lu Renjia wasn't going to react particularly positively. The girl wiped away her tears and began to come to her senses little by little. She wasn't very tired of it because there is only one such drug in their town. But Shinon didn't deviate from his original plan. He proposed another option, namely to ask Lu Renjia to give up the escort and he would give her the essence, assuring that under his protection, the girl wouldn't be harmed by the S-class beast. The guy who rescued Xian's older sister figured out what the deal was. The bespectacled man was not counting all this nonsense just to get his hands on the thing that was now in the hands of another delivery man. He thought that this essence not only allowed him to awaken the superpowers of ordinary people, but also helped those who had already received the power to increase their abilities. And then squeezing the flask tighter and teasingly looking at it, he replied that he didn't agree to such a deal. Now then, Shinon realized that he was dealing with a rather knowledgeable person, but he continued to claim that he didn't want to help Xian for the sake of that essence. And then an idea came into his head to dilute this conversation a little, and he grabbed his revolver. He doesn't know how Lu Renjia's managed to trick Xian's sister since she gave away such an important item, but as Xian's attendant, who the guy already thought he was, he wouldn't let a stranger take what belonged to her, all while pointing a weapon at the other person. And the girl stood behind and tried to verbally stop this altercation. As suddenly the enemy disappeared from the spot he had just stood on, which the scoundrel with the gun did not expect. Lu Renjia appeared behind the threatening guy's back and with a slyness in his voice asked for the opportunity to tell one little secret, and that was the fact that he just hates being threatened with firearms. Just a shock, only the leaves rustled from being so fast. Shinon couldn't understand how the guy ended up behind him, and immediately turned around, trying not to blunder in front of such a low rank. But there was no danger. The guy was just handing over the essence to Xian, saying that since this item belonged to her sister, let her decide for herself who she would choose as her escort. The girl began to ponder her further decision, frowning audibly reasoned that the reward and the fee would be the same and there was no point in taking something of worse quality. Because of that, absolutely dashing all of Lu Renjia's hopes, issued a decision that it was worth hiring a more high-level and beautiful escort. But even after that, she started making excuses and asking the original helper not to misunderstand her, because she is very grateful that he came and saved her, but she is thinking about her safety. Shannon commented on this choice as reasonable and looked triumphantly at his rival in this matter, and the latter only had to accept this choice since everything was decided and let the pair go on. When the motorcycle had gone a decent distance away, Lu Renjia breathed a sigh of relief that he was finally rid of the two problems and could go about his business in peace. And then he turned to the monster, for something had to be done with its corpse and it seemed even clearer to him what. But he didn't expect to notice something else there. His eyes widened and his eyebrows lowered, pondering what he saw. The hell beast had the same mark as the one that had attacked the village and almost killed Xian's sister, which meant that the guy's torment wasn't over and he would still have to go after those two. 150 years ago, when disaster struck this world, the elite were sent to refugee camps that had been prepared especially for Naya. And after the catastrophe, this group of people, in order to rebuild civilization, founded beacon guides known as Dragon, Fish, Snake, Bull, and Bear, each with a bunker in it. And Renju was being sent to the jurisdiction of Pisces that time, and no one was supposed to know about who the guy really was, so it was asked if the fighter had found a way to hide his identity. The guy was standing there in a ridiculous suit asking the old man not to worry, because he had everything covered. It didn't inspire confidence at all. That's why he had the very mark he had shown when he met the other courier flew into his face. While the guy was backing away from such a throw right in the head, the boss ordered him to take that emblem with him. And then he showed the very same insignia on the screen that the brown-haired man had already managed to see on several monsters, explaining that people with that insignia like to attack couriers, so it was worth waiting for them to just swallow their bait. The guy looked at what he had been issued, and had no words for how low he had been lowered in rank, to a common courier. Shannon and Xian were rushing on a sidecar motorcycle at high speed, leaving only dust behind them. The girl kept thinking about her sister, holding a box of medicines in her hands. Everything inside was whimpering with the realization of losing the only person she had ever known. The guy turned on the very guardian and charming persona again, and assured her that as long as the traveling companion was driving his Rolls-Royce, they would fulfill her sister's wish together. Though the transport was already shabby, the girl still believed that it was something very cool, because it was the first time she saw such an unusual vehicle, and then asked if the one whom she now called Mr. Black Iron had it. Shannon replied that a courier of that rank didn't have anywhere to get something like that from, and high-level couriers were stronger and had to go to more dangerous lands. That's why they use such vehicles, just to waste less energy and be able to escape in time. And the level of Black Iron is the lowest. They only run errands, so they can't afford such things. And then Xian Din crossing reminded herself that despite all that, that guy had managed to get behind Shannon's back in a matter of seconds, and she thought it was a pretty cool trick. Her defender, of course, did not like this course of conversation and became angry and made excuses that he was just being inattentive. And then he took out the essence and started thinking that as long as he had this thing he would be able to do much more, become stronger. Suddenly, Lu Renjia appeared on a ledge near the cliff and warned the arrogant man that if he didn't keep his eyes on the road, he would just break his machine, calling him great. Sinan was startled by this. They began to skid and needed to slow down as quickly as possible. He didn't understand how the guy got here, and the girl didn't expect to meet Mr. Black Iron again in such a place, right in the middle of a deserted road. The guy joked away, avoiding the answer, said that the driver's jalopy was so nosy that only a deaf man would find it, and then reminded that he had strayed a bit from the topic he wanted to talk about. But as soon as I heard the strange sound, I paid attention to it. The wreckage of the rear was being held onto by a huge hellbeast that went from a monkey, very unexpected and unpleasant guests indeed, and it looked like they were in for a second round of battle right here and now. The primate threw his glower of danger a look that boded no good, only death if the beast was not defeated. The cataclysm created the lords of the new world. These were the undead. The Courier Alliance categorized them into 6 ranks, and even the weakest Thun rank surpasses humans in power, which is naturally very dangerous for the humans themselves. But there was something even scarier than the GR rank, whose power was something you didn't have to worry much about. According to legend, spends most of their time deep in the mountain ranges. They are true killing machines, from which there is no point in even running away. It is better to just accept death. And that situation was happening now, too, as the heroes found themselves right in the face of their greatest danger to date. And man before the fall thing was like an ant before a giant in both strength and size, which was obvious. This huge macaque was breathing heavily. It seemed its breath could blow a person several kilometers away. The monster jumped down from the height of a multi-story building with a scream and pounding his fists on his chest, ready to blow all the people below to smithereens, eyes glowing with aggression. All he did was growl and see these characters downstairs as foo. So fear ran through everyone's skin with goosebumps. The first to surrender was Xian, who squealed in fear. It was understandable. The girl was no hero. Lu Renjia leaned over to the girl and sniffed her, pulling the air deeper into his nostrils. And then he asked nothing if the others felt the same as him, but the other courier just tried to ignore it, saying this was no time for chatter. He began to smarten up, saying that it's called the monkey mi and that he had heard that this species before the cataclysm was engaged in the fact that it snatched food from people, so do not worry much. And moreover, he's a typical C-rank representative, nothing more, and it wouldn't be a huge problem for Shinanu to deal with him the same way he had dealt with that past one. He rudely told the monster to fuck off because he wouldn't find food here. Lu Renjia, on the other hand, mocked the guy, asking him about whether he was trying to look cool in front of a monkey, while the girl asked Mr. Senian to be more careful. The monster accelerated and ran towards its meal, gaining speed more and more, shaking the ground around it. And after enough speed, the infernal beast shoved off the ground and jumped high into the air, swinging its fist, promising to crush the people standing below. Xian was in a stupor from fright, and Lu Renjia didn't give off a single emotion, as if they were just an ordinary fly trying to attack them. Xinyan pointed his revolver with the words that this monster was a real impudent person since he was so foolish and arrogant to make counter steps towards his death. The shot came right in the shoulder near the neck. Now the beast was screaming from the poly, though the small bullets must have felt like mere pebbles to him. Their speed was enough to pierce the skin and bring a sharp feeling inside. The courier rushed to his transport and watched the outcome of events. The mutant missed. He needed time to recover simply because he was thrown off the right course by such a sudden attack that managed to make him uncomfortable. The guy with the glasses pulled back a bit, keeping at least some distance from the danger. As much as he wasn't sure he could overpower this monster, he should have reassured himself. Makaka understood and said that he had a wound and was feeling the pain. That anger had subsided for a second, but it was likely the calm before the storm. It was unclear if the gun just didn't work, and Senian asked to have patience and wait a bit. Suddenly the wound began to throb, and the hell beast paid attention to it. It was a strange feeling, and he didn't know how things would unfold. Suddenly he let out all the air with a scream from his throat. A limb was ripped off, a bunch of blood splattered from the wound, and it was an intolerable pain that was almost impossible to endure. At the conclusion, Sahinan threw a pathos phrase that nothing else would hurt, building his sternest gaze. Xian was delighted with her new protector. She sucked up, saying that this was a worthy response from a master of his rank, which embarrassed the guy and made him get out of character. And he once again asserted himself, saying that a coppersmith wouldn't be able to do this. And then Lu Renjia looked up, and now realizing how terrible their imminent battle would be, but without giving any sign of it, he turned to the silversmith with a question that had been troubling him. Namely, whether he remembers his words that monster was a typical uncleanness. On the roofs of destroy high-rises showed other hellish beasts. One was scarier than the other, creepy mutant. Such can be seen only in horror movies. There was an ominous silence in the middle of this street until it was broken by the roar of a motorcycle engine. It looked like it was time to make our feet while we could. Wheels rumbled on the ground. The trio touched off, saving their lives, leaving a trail of smoke and dust behind him. Picked up speed, but the monsters were not sitting around waiting for the moment when they could miss their prey, so massively began to jump off the roofs to catch up with the victims. Lu Renjia noticed that Sahinan's jalopy was barely moving and creaking a lot and asked if it was okay, or if he was still putting their integrity in danger right now, to which the other guy aggressively ordered them to shut their mouths, or better yet, leave this vehicle and prepared a revolver. Holding the steering wheel with one hand, with the other the courier in glasses began to shoot back from the mutants behind them, who were already catching up, and the guy behind tried to move so that he wouldn't accidentally catch a bullet with his body. And the bullets were hitting hitting the foul thing, leaving bloody wounds that began to whimper and throb. The ability worked. One of them had his head explode, and so did a few others, except that the others were not at all intimidated or stopped by it. They had no intention of missing their food at such a happy moment when they themselves had come here. Suddenly, at the height, one mutant struck a heroic pose and waited for something, seemingly as if he was waiting for the others to pay attention to him. The hellbeast looked around, breathing heavily, and was silent for a while, but then he took in a lungful of air. A high-pitched growl was heard, calling the others to action, and the primates standing nearby had already rushed to attack. The others had climbed out of their hiding places and sat waiting, but full of tension and ready to tear the humans apart. The monsters followed the fleeing ones with a glance, moving closer to the edge of the rooftop so they wouldn't waste time and could better think out their jump. The fleeing heroes were in total danger, right in death's grasp. They didn't realize where so many of them had come from. They were going for broke, and the monkeys were repeating words about enemies and revenge on them. Lu Renjia decided to show his intelligence and experience, and made the point that when you kill someone from the pack, the congeners would immediately swoop in, thus you could run into a wave of foulness. Now the girl was panicking even more. What were they going to do now? And it was a real punishment for Sungin to hear that he had miscalculated on something and only made the problem bigger. So he reacted with aggression, and asked not to talk nonsense. He absolutely did not need guidance from a courier of such a low rank, so only tried to shoot away from the monsters faster. The mutants were dying and exploding one by one, and the guys could at least clear their way somehow. The guy with glasses asked the smart guy what to do if not to shoot. Is it really just to wait for death? And then ordered the other to get off the bike and show him how to solve the problem. This was not the act of a noble courier, but a common coward and arrogant, who did not understand the whole situation, had no shame or remorse. And the interlocutor replied that if he was asked to do so, he would do so, except that he wrapped his arms around Xian before doing so. He lifted her in his arms, though against her own will, and replied that there was indeed a solution to the problem. Xian didn't understand what his foe was up to and was against such a decision. But before he could object, the boy and the girl disappeared from sight, leaving only emptiness. Xian screamed for the courier to let her go, or rather bring her back to a means of transportation that gives at least some chance of surviving the situation. She screamed and yelled with stupidity, as if she blindly failed to see that her so-called handsome man was nothing but a puffed-up turkey who couldn't do anything without his gun. The guy landed, hitting the rocks hard, purposely lifting the girl a little higher so as not to injure her. The debris fell, kicking up dust upwards, blocking the monster's view and causing them to jump into the unknown. It was only now that Xian realized what had just happened. The sand and earth from the leak that Lu Renjia had picked up crashed into his nose. In the dust, something was happening. A terrible sound could be heard and the ground shook. The hell beasts rushed at the motorcyclist with goggles, with burning eyes and unbearable screams, ready to tear the human flesh and crush the motorcycle. The courier was in genuine shock, and only now that the extra eyes had left him was able to show it on his face rather than make it up by how fearless and cold he was. He only pressed harder on the gas, not even trying to turn around to shoot because there wasn't time, and cursed Lu Renjia for setting him up and fusing all the creatures on him. As the mutants rushed past, pursued by the humming motorcycle with their food, Renjia himself and Xian waited out the gorge, with the hope that none of the hell beasts would look in their direction while they were busy chasing. The guy laughed at the pompousness of their traveling companion, saying let him deal with them himself while they waited it out in peace, while the girl worried about the one she liked. And poor Sunan tried to save himself and shouted, hoping that he would hear him, that the coppersmith would still pay him. The beasts attacked, roaring about crushing and avenging the insolent man for killing their brother. They were very fearsome, strong and fast. All they saw in the guy on the motorcycle was a ride and a target to kill as quickly as possible. With every and they were getting closer and closer to their goal and were about to almost catch up. Macaca swung at the motorcyclist, and a little more and there would be absolutely nothing left of the guy. Just a wet spot. Sakinan's mind was in chaos as he thought about what he should do now to survive. And suddenly some thought did come, so he only turned the gas knob harder to enact a spontaneous, risky plan that could have ended badly. The hell beast struck the ground, creating only a hole in the ground, from which only huge chunks were left. It seemed like that was it. No one would brag and show off. But then the monster looked at his hand. But there was nothing there, which was very unexpected. And then the mutant looked at the wall nearby that was making the sound, as it appeared that Sahinin was able to pull off such a complicated trick. So he still showed himself as a good fighter and an arrogant guy who threw around pathos phrases like it's no harm for a monster to dream, and pulled out a revolver. Without a second thought, the guy started shooting at the macaque, just to hit the right spot and kill the enemy. And then he drove off the wall and hit the gas, squeezing as much out of his iron horse as he could just to save himself from death. He looked at his enemies and realized that even though there were many beasts, their level was still as low, so he was confident that he could handle no matter how many there were. These were excuses, and an additional such excuse was that he saw fleeing as another way to find a way out, since these beasts couldn't catch up with him anyway, and tried to convince himself that it wasn't that he was chickening out, but that the bullets were just too expensive. But his head was additionally occupied with dreams that as soon as he would get away from the monsters, he would show the coppersmith all his skill in bobbing with him. I wanted to immediately think about everything that would do to him, but then I noticed a huge monster on one of the roofs of a neighboring house. Thoth simply snatched up a column-like piece of concrete with one hand and lifted it up, in readiness to do what was already obvious. The guy, seeing this, was in complete shock, because he thought that his torment is already over. And here is another situation in which he should consider all further actions, which depends on the length of his life, or rather, whether it will last at least one more day. A concrete column, as if something light flew from the roof straight at the courier, tearing through the air with its weight. But he had no time to do anything in this situation but beg for help and mercy, as the column was too close to him. And then there was a thud followed by a cloud of earth and dust. It seemed like everything. Now it was definitely the end of one of the strongest couriers of his rank. Meanwhile, Lu Renjia had opened a thermos from which steamed a hot drink. He took that long-awaited sip. The warm liquid enveloped his throat and seemed to breathe a second life into the guy. But it was a little bit of each, so he closed the container immediately, leaving something else for later, finally able to collect his thoughts and give them some clarity. But Xian didn't see now as the right time to savor the moment and the goodies from the bag. That the guy wasn't going for any other reaction, so he just offered the girl a drink of hot water too, and the girl only asked in response, how could one be so thoughtless, since there were unclean things everywhere and they could be killed at any minute. The girl judged from the sounds that came from their hiding place and assumed that the wearer of the jacket she was now wearing was dead. That her partner didn't seem to care much about this news and offered to escort Xian to the settlement, and planned to return for his corpse afterward. A nasty smirk flashed across his face. Now he was repaying their disrespect. But the girl was already almost tearfully begging not to do what Lu Renjia was saying. It was too cruel. And then she thought about all the supplies the dead man had in his motorcycle and now she couldn't go back to the village without them. And then Mr. Blackiron asked about if her supplies were in the box beside him. The girl looked at her box and said no, otherwise she wouldn't be so worried. There were only the most common ones there, much more important to deliver flavones for pregnant women, which was why she wasn't thinking about her safety right now. That the girl gave those drugs to Sunan for preservation and without it the newborns will be in danger. The question is what to do now. And Lu Renjia with the same smirk as before said that the girl had nothing to worry about. He was just kidding. And it came as a terrible shock. Such things are no good to joke about. Where their new acquaintance seemed to have died, everything was more or less in shame. After all, there was a reason why Sahinin had a silver level. A bunch of monkeys wouldn't do anything to him, unless a higher-ranked fiend appeared, which seemed to be happening right now. All the macaques stopped their attack, watching as that monster approached its victim that it had just almost killed. He stood still, gathering other monsters near him, but of a lower rank, but such a combo did not please any courier. And now Shannon began to guess that in fact it was probably the leader of the pack, since everyone listened to him so obediently and stood behind his back. He was really creepy. He had weird things on his shoulders. And their mouths opened and red eyes lit up from within, muttering something. A human head appeared from there. The monster was inordinately pleased with the new prey, a courier, and a silver level 1 at that, and then laughed in anger. A horrible sight, a human head, with red eyes whose eyelids were as if stapled together, widening the hole for the eyeball, and the corners of the lips cut and stapled in the same way. Now, Sunyan felt very creepy too. If before he hid it well and convinced himself otherwise, now he was being truthful with his feelings. Depressing atmosphere. It seemed to the guy that apparently from the fact, at the level of beasts was much higher than before, So now you have to be more careful and pick the right moment. But not to attack, but to escape. As suddenly the monster swung his arm and the guy flew aside like a ball. Sean began to tell her that their peak settlement was all women, and they always had a lack of protection. And because of this they had to bear the offenses of robbers and foul things. So it was decided that each generation of the settlement would choose one duty, and that girl would have to marry a strong inducer, thus providing protection. All for the sake of the settlement's continued existence, even though these were measures against the will of the girls themselves. So every new life is always a hope for their future. Now then Sean hoped that her interlocutor understood why Flavanol was so important. But there was silence. The guy wasn't exactly hiding the fact that he wasn't interested in it. But since he'd been told everything, why not? And then suddenly, he wondered why Sean had taken over the delivery. Shouldn't it have been done by their protectors? Anyone would have been better than the girl and her sister. Immediately, the girl blushed a little, covered her face with her hand, and asked wasn't Sean engaged in the delivery. And Lu Renjia did not expect to hear such a thing. And it turns out that what the interlocutor called his sister's dowry was indeed her sister's dowry. So the guy agreed to a blind date. And after Sean chose that guy. And the courier asked why. Is it because of the level? And the answer was completely different. Xinyang is tall and sturdy. The girl immediately became bewildered. In a word, fell in love. Her partner tensed. Something inside began to stir, now becoming uncomfortable. Now the thing is bad. The guy realized what was going on and what was really going on now. Sean couldn't understand what Lu Renjia was up to and demanded him to explain everything. But he only replied that there was no time to explain, so it was better to let him follow. When they arrived at the scene, there was an overturned motorcycle and sidecar lying there, and a pile of dust all around. The girl didn't understand what had happened here, examining all the evidence, and Lu Renjia summarized that the bespectacled man had interrupted quite a few monkeys. It turns out the guy survived, and the delivery guy said it was all bad news. And now the girl has figured it out. It's the missing Flavanol for newborns, and the village is in great danger because of it. After all, there were supplies here for a long time, and it was unclear what to do. And Xinyang was also missing. Lu Renjia hadn't counted on that guy being of so little use and didn't last a couple minutes. He assumed he must have run into a higher-ranked monster. The girl, on the other hand, was going through her things hoping maybe something had survived. And then, after a couple of seconds she was upset because she realized that everything had been left in front of Sehunan. The courier ordered him to get up and not whine. They needed to move on. It's better to get on the trail as quickly as possible. We need to get the cure back at the very least. So let him pray in hopes that the monkeys don't gobble him up along with all his stuff. But Sean countered by saying that what was the point of going for a silver level if one had a copper level oneself. Lu Renjia didn't deny it, but objected to the girl, saying that he is the strongest in his level. The guy made his ward shut up. In the middle of the thicket stood ruined buildings and everything was overgrown with moss. No human soul with anything resembling a brain in its head would walk here. There was only wreckage and silence everywhere, interrupted occasionally by a loud growl. Sethunman's head was splitting. He heard someone inquiring about what seemed to him as he moved. When he opened his eyes, he saw a horrible sight beneath him. The guy was suspended upside down high from the ceiling, and down below on the floor were a bunch of monsters who were being ordered by the ringleader to shake their victim, but they were having no luck. The same creepy monster with a mutilated human head inside was looking around. The monsters were going over the corpses of people with limbs sticking out, arms and legs stitched together, scalps removed, and also marveling at the fact that they were all dead. It was all what he called garbage, and then he remembered that they still had the silversmith, who was left as the best delicacy. Sunmin didn't close his eyes back and watched the whole nightmare for real, and at first he didn't even move an eye. And then that same fearsome monster appeared in front of his face, vile and disgusting. The courier immediately screamed, and anyone would have understood him. The boy swayed from side to side and begged to be let go. He had belongings and money and was willing to give anything his captors were interested in. He could provide them with any food. Only their food was not him. The monster was shocked at such foolishness. The behemoth heard and realized that Xinyang didn't want to become the same. That's what he was actually yelling about. That the hell beast didn't care at all. Since it didn't work out with the others, this guy should definitely live. After all, he was barely fished out. The courier calmed down. There was nothing left but to accept the situation, otherwise he would be finished off right here and now. and to beg for mercy, and mercy was absolutely hopeless. But still he tried to ask about whether they could let him go, as if he didn't understand anything, and before that, it seems he was not only a coward but also a fool. The monster replied that he just had completely different plans for the hero who dared to kill a bunch of hell beasts. His job was to conceive a child with the female monsters of this mutant species, and the children would be born completely different, would be different. So the guy started shouting at the whole neighborhood for these macaques to get away from him, and begging for help, hoping that someone would hear him and release him, and he was heard by his acquaintances, with whom he had been in a recent fight. Lu Renjia noticed that even in such a situation, this pompous hassock remains jumpy and alert. The guy further wet his throat with warm water, and Xian stood with binoculars trying to figure out what the monkeys were going to do to him, and her partner thought the critters with false eyelashes looked funny. The girl was curious about what their plan was, and offered to slip in there at an opportune moment, but Lu Renjia interrupted her. He wondered, however, if she had seen the mark on his back, and if the shaitan had never seen one like it anywhere before. But the latter replied that she had seen nothing of the sort until then, and then asked what was the matter. Lu Renjia said that he had encountered this himself before, and then tried to explain it all to the girl. The undead have flooded the ruins, but there is no news of them in the vicinity of the Union. Apparently the ringleader is in control, and, to fight him, you need to defeat absolutely everyone. If you kill him, then the companions will sort out who goes where, and the nearest settlements will be destroyed. Except the problem is, Lu Renjia has closed his thermos that his abilities are time-limited. Xian had already lost any hope, and had almost accepted the fact that Shannon was considered dead, and the medicine was lost. But the interlocutor asked her not to worry. The leader is not so scary, but the fact that they attack in turn, this is really troublesome. Suddenly a smile appeared on her face, because there is a chance. He leaned over to Xian and so interrogated him about what came into his mind about this situation. And so after he had stared at her for too long with that intense gaze, she was terrified of what this madman was up to. Lu Renjia's face became not that hopeful of a sensible ending to his idea. The guy like some maniac said that Xian smelled very good, and this was already suggestive of a clue to his plan. It took a couple of minutes to tie the trap and hang it from a huge beam. The victim of a sick fantasy begged to be untied, but the courier bent his lie, saying that the undead were to scatter and it would be hard for the guy to deal with them. It was a different matter if they crowded together. But Xian, either from the stress of the situation or from her stupidity, didn't understand why Lu Renjia had tied her up and what was the point of it, and got the answer that she would be a trap. While they were talking, the overgrown primates had already picked up on something amiss. The guy had to deal with them at once. There was no way to stretch such a thing out. Then the cases would turn out too badly. Screams spread throughout this area, but no one would come to help. A backwoods place, but what a dangerous place. It was the monsters that were approaching Sunan, and he was completely jerked and crabby. But suddenly the monkeys stopped, though before it had been more than confident and purposeful. By now they were already clamoring all around, creating and responding to the call of their fellow creatures. Xinyan, who had almost accepted his death, suddenly realized that this was his little chance, but it was unclear what was happening. Huge paws skittered across the ground, kicking up dust, the mutants fleeing from the scene. At first, there was no normal explanation of what had happened, that they had rushed away so quickly and unexpectedly. The leader of this entire pack had already realized what had caused such a commotion. The smell had entered his nostrils, and it had become such a magnet to beckon him as well. The beasts of hell had gone feral and were already rushing in a huge crowd in that direction, where they smelled the sweetest notes, as if people on Black Friday were rushing to the stores without seeing each other, ready to crush their own kind. Only now could one realize how numerous they really were. They were like the sea, covering the horizon with their bodies. The girl who had been the decoy began to panic even more, and she realized they were getting closer. Xian began to panic. It was understandable. A whole cloud wanted to tear her apart, and now she was willing to give up everything just to not be in this position. Lu Renjia asked the girl not to pretend that she didn't understand anything. It was still perfectly clear that the bait had worked. But Xian really couldn't understand how it all worked and why they were so crazy about her fragrance. The guy dropped a huge iron structure right onto the crowd of primates, while explaining in passing that the companion is a celestial awakener because the ability to awaken is linked to smell. And the girl became even more confused, though it explained the situation a little, but somehow it didn't get any better on her soul. The guy added that Xian couldn't control it yet, although she was still weak, but here he was and the monkeys smelled this fragrance, which attracted them. To awaken the abilities, people can resort to genetic evolutionists, but there are those who have them from birth. They are called a kind of heavenly awakener. The power of such people exceeds that of ordinary people and, as a side effect of their power, can get out of control, so the Alliance tracks them down to eliminate them. Potmo warned that if Xian didn't want to reveal her identity, she should hang peacefully now and not beat. And then Lu Renjia noticed something else down below, and now it was a small victory considering they had been waiting for something like this for quite some time. The primates were almost entirely gathered at the foot of this high-rise, but they were all waiting for something. Without acting further, they hoped that someone would appear in their midst, and that someone was right there now. The leader of their pack was making his way among the larger, but weaker monsters from him. There was a silence and a stillness that was hard to break. A human, but incredibly creepy-looking face, looked at the girl, and it was as if he was going insane from the fact that the awakener was in front of him. Xian frantically swallowed her saliva. Her pupils narrowed and her lips trembled with fear. It was not clear what was about to happen. The wild beast was maddened. He thought the new victim was just lovely. The girl was even better than a silversmith and perfect for them. They could not even expect that such a miracle would fall into their hands. Well, or paws. His crazed laughter spilled out in a dirty, smelly stream across the abandoned area. The very thought of who they had found made sweet images run through his mind. Lu Renjia stood on the edge of the high-rise and didn't linger on it for long. It was time to start, and it was worth gathering all the thoughts and strength not to make a mistake. The guy took off his jacket. It was like a leaf rose into the air, foretelling the start of a great fight. His hair erupted in bright flames, followed by his eyebrows. Even his face seemed to have tons of flame running down it. Now he could show what he was really capable of. He had waited so long for all these so-called guests, and finally he had a chance to show them who was boss. The pack leader noticed something amiss and didn't understand what this power was. The girl was already beginning to doubt that the guy next to her was just a coppersmith, even though she'd seen his emblem. He looked at her and replied that Xian could be absolutely sure of that, but the glowing red eyes still did not inspire faith in those words. He jumped down, setting himself up to release a tremendous amount of power, leaving energy on the wall behind him, his speed gaining more and more momentum. Even at a young age, Xian knew that she was an awakener, so the Alliance would resort to any method to catch the girl. They would have to lock her up and experiment on her until they killed her. And her sister just begged her to promise that the girl would never, ever reveal this secret to others. She didn't want to lose her little sister. But Xian was unsure that no one would be able to find out completely by accident, so she asked about such a scenario. The elder sister replied that in that case, if something like that happened, before that person could tell anyone else the secret, the girl should be ready to kill him. And right now, Xian watched her partner leave dust in the air behind him from his speed, and thought about the fact that it looked like she would have to fulfill her kinsman's advice. She watched the pile of reddish smoke, was elusive and overconfidently raring to fight, as if she knew 100% that she would win. The beasts were going crazy. They began to scream and break into frenzied roars. Lu Renjia stood in the center of the infernal-looking beasts of hell, ready to tear the courier into small pieces. The monkeys did not hesitate and rushed at the man, hitting, tearing with their claws. They were on top of each other no longer and did not notice that they were beginning to torment each other. It was a brutal fight in which there was no chance for any human to survive. A normal would have already died after one primate, and even a very strong courier could not appease such a number of perhaps not the strongest hell beasts. But Lu Renjia was able to scatter everyone and show who was stronger here. He was sparking with a strange neon fire that looked more like something with lightning bolts and had absolutely no difficulty at all. Xian now realized that the mission to kill the extra witness was not feasible under any circumstances. He was too strong to try to grapple with. The pack leader himself couldn't believe his eyes. It had been a long time since he had been in the presence of such a powerful courier. He wondered if this guy was suddenly an enhanced awakener. Lu Renjia was literally hollowing out the pinch beneath him just by standing on it with his feet, gathering power from everywhere he could. His pulse pounding in his head. With simple movements, He channeled power around and exterminated the hell beasts at an incredible speed, as if it was no problem for him. He was able to create an impossibly huge arm that rose above the stone jungle of high-rise buildings. It was a far cry from the strength of an ordinary courier. Severed limbs flew to the sides, which were bleeding, and Xiang realized that something was wrong and her acquaintance was not telling her something. The flaming guy was standing right in front of the huge monster, the main monster in this pack, and not a single bit of his body trembled in terror. Finally, Lu Renjia replied that the opponent is wrong about the courier being an enhanced awakener, and that is absolutely not the case. And the hell beast couldn't believe it all. For someone to achieve such power on their own, the probability of such a thing was incredibly small. An intimidating vile smile shone on the monster's face. He would like to test this hero's strength, but even more he would like to get this trophy for himself. It was just a day of surprises for him and his underlings, one victim after another. Never had the monster encountered such a body before. He realized that he needed to somehow not damage the enemy to make him useful in his experiments. But Lu Renjia was not going to back down either. And since he had dealt with his monkeys, he would be able to help him achieve such a fate. He would defeat all of them without exception. The infernal beast took its head out of the strange body, from its nub with what seemed to be teeth that, once out, became mere sharp bitchless to protect the soft tissue. Veins swelled on his blue arms, and he was finally able to accept that he had a worthy opponent, so he too would change his tactics. The hell beast was fully convinced that the guy deserved to behold the true power of the monster standing across from him. Tasked not so much compared to the others, a body grown several times its size, curvy, with lots of big arms that were hard to drag along the floor, a creepy face that was attached as if on meat wires. Xiang looked at all of this and assumed it was the power of the senior rank. The wind that was rising in the air loosened her up on the rope and covered her face with her developing hair. And the monster seemed amused by this. He didn't realize if this was some kind of joke. He's much stronger than a typical senior level. Lu Renjia ordered the freak across the street to shut up. He doesn't feel the slightest bit of fear, but advised him to fear for his life. And then the infernal beast erupted in madness. He was asking his opponent to come closer, promising that when the leader of the pack of monsters finished his experiment, the guy would become like him and exceed his limit. The monster bullet flew up into the sky, thus annoying the hero, playing cat and mouse, thus anticipating his victory and stretching his pleasure. The hell beast was having an incredible amount of fun with this kind of entertainment, and Lu Renjia was out of his mind from being interrupted and not being allowed to speak normally. Xinyan stepped out of his place of confinement to freedom, happily breathing in the fresh air of freedom. He stood there bewildered at what was even going on and why the place had emptied out so abruptly, and they had just tried to maim and take his life. And then suddenly, he wondered why he was the one standing post if he needed to slip away as fast as possible and do it as quickly as possible. Except that during his escape he noticed something, and it was the pack leader, who not too long ago was going to turn the guy into his own kind. Except the one wasn't paying any attention at all, and it was obvious why. Everything around him exploded and billowed with smoke. Lu Renjia was blazing both inside and out. Now was his time to speak and finish what he started. He wanted his answer. Sakinin watched the whole scene and couldn't tell if it was real. In front of him stood the familiar coppersmith, but in a new image, dangerous in appearance. He was asking the monster opposite about what a silent walker was and what purpose all these hellish beasts were pursuing. All around there were puffs of dust and dirt in the air that made it hard to perceive everything normally. But the beast itself didn't understand what the guy they now wanted to kill each other with was talking about. And Lu Renjia saw the falseness in those emotions. Then his eyes lit up with a spark of anger. He ordered his opponent not to dare to feign. And he knows very well that the monster has his mark on his body. And then the infernal beast admitted that he had once been a courier too. And such a sudden change of subject to long ago events surprised the lad to a kind of stupor. As it turned out, one day the then courier woke up in one of the loaded cylinders, completely unaware of what was happening, could not realize who he was and where he was. Following the dictates of the body's senses, he came across a group of unclean things, and the same monster that was chained to the guy's body for some reason was their leader. Except that the guy trapped in his body was never him. He had once thought of returning to the human settlement, but no one there was willing to talk to him before. And especially after that he was incredibly lonely. And now Sunyan had also intervened in the conversation, finally realizing about why the monster was so eager to get at him, and wanted to change everything with his help. It occurred to the hell beast that since he had no kin of his own, Why not create some and thus be lonely? And then, with a mad voice, he asserted that with these 3 guys, he would have made it 100%. Lu Renjia began to come out from his past state and began to ponder on this idea of sewing everyone together in pieces and confirmed that it was indeed a good idea. The courier had one question, and if the monster answered it, he could safely take the bespectacled man for himself. To which the hellbeast first rejoiced, and then reminded him that this guy was the worst option, and for some reason Sahunan was only confused by that. His first place from the end in the ranking, not by the fact that he was going to be given to be reshaped. And the lad's question was that he wondered if the creepy interlocutor remember where he woke up. And the man replied without hesitation that of course he remembered, and it was out west. That as soon as the phrase came out of his lips, his face began to swell and his eye began to pop out of its orbit. Something was glowing in the sky, right behind Lu Renjia's head. He deflected, realizing what was about to happen. Immediately the monster exploded, spitting out its blood like a punctured bag of red liquid. The courier covered at least his face with his hands, though it was useless. Lu Renjia had seen a lot of things and was prepared, it seemed, for a lot of things, but he hadn't expected this turn of events, so revealing a face that did get blood on it. The hell beast's body was gone, leaving a huge red puddle. The courier was disappointed. He had expected a slightly different turn of events, and only now did Shannon realize that his acquaintance was willing to give him away instead of answering the question. There were shouts of joy throughout the village. The girls were telling the others to come out, because Xian had returned, and they immediately began to harass her with questions about why she was alone, whether it was dangerous. The girl replied that it was very dangerous, but she was helped by a talented person, which interested her friends very much. But the main thing was that she brought the medicine. The residents looked at Sunnan, assuming that this person was him, talented and the like. And on top of that, the girls pounced on him, praising his appearance, talking about his luxurious hair and pumped-up body. And he immediately started to seize the moment and introduce himself, saying that he was a silver-level courier. And now Xian didn't understand how one could act like an animal. Her eyes were finally opened. Except she remembered that she and Lu Renjia share a little secret, and now she had to think about what to do. It was about how she and her sister had talked as children, and the girl wondered what would happen if someone found out about her peculiarity. The older sister had not expected such a question, and thought about the likelihood of such an event. But even here she was not particularly confused and replied that there was only one way out in such a case, stroking the baby's head. In such a situation, the only option would be to marry that person, no matter how much you don't want to. Lu Renjia was walking his way and suddenly sneezed, remembering the omen, thinking it was his old man who remembered. It was hard to imagine that now the girl he rescued was thinking about something like that. His mind was spinning with his own thoughts, for example, that there was a lot of things in the West and what exactly he should look for. Then took out his emblem and examined it once again, concluding that this badge is just awful. Could he not be given a level even a little higher? In the age of the end of the world, brigands took over and the undead began to run amok, and from lords in the food chain, humans turned into ants. When the terrible apocalypse first began, humans survived by capturing whatever creatures they could get their hands on. Afterwards, the representatives of our race gathered in the main city, and that is what became their refuge. During the end of the world at least, cities performed different functions, thus supporting human civilization, like organs, and the transfer of materials with circulating blood. And the guards were responsible for this. Although the guards have outstanding strength, but the transfer process is extremely difficult and dangerous. But the guards do not give up hope. So one group of people, led by a representative of one of the strong men, the captain was already on a very long journey. It was necessary to hold out a little longer, for they had almost reached their destination. But though such paths were given easily, or at least normally, one of the whole troop could no longer walk and suggested to the guide to stop for a snack to renew his strength at least a little. Then the large man with a scar over his left eye asked Xiao Yu if they had anything to eat, if only for the old man, entering his situation. The boy motionlessly replied that Leon, in charge of food, was crossing the river, and there were no dry rations left, as well as no medicines, which didn't please anyone in the formation. But the old man's pleas to do something could not leave the captain indifferent to the problem, so the man ordered everyone to disperse and find something to eat. It was at least a small victory. They would not have to die of hunger and lack of strength. The captain added that his subordinates should not move around much and in no way disturb the monsters. The captain thought about everything that had happened to them. This guard had been laboring for a week now, and yes, Xiaoliu had already fought. They had suffered a loss of 12 men who had died, but he realized that those who were with him now were working hard, and when he returned, he would have to reward them for their efforts. His musings were interrupted by the captain's call. One of the squad had found something. It was a huge cockroach mutating into a large animal that no longer seemed harmless and easy to kill. But for some reason others didn't realize what it was, even though the main thing for them was whether or not they could eat the creature. Then the man who caught the critter, tearing off the insect's legs, marveled that the companions had never before met this insect, and explained that before the disaster it was called a cockroach, said to be the most tenacious creature. The guy took a bite out of his alpaca, saying that he'd heard before that this pest tasted like chicken, and the people standing around would be happy if that was true. One of the crowd asked the guy if such a flavor was really in their prey, and the daredevil who took a bite of the meat froze in place, trying to get a good taste of what was in his mouth. And the problem was a little different. That guy had no clue what chicken should taste like, and already that had upset the people around him. And soaps like this were what the guy had been taught by old man Liu. And now it was already true. The former captain had died a few years ago, but the wounds of his loss still remained, so it was best to change the topic of this conversation. The man continued to tell what he knew about these creatures, such as the fact that they lived in groups and should take a better look around, but it didn't seem to be relevant anymore. The dead insects king were already around. While the guy was saying that they should find them all and then get a good meal, a cloud of these vile creatures was already behind him and rushing forward. His friends were simply shocked by this, but no one had time to react. So sudden and quick was this moment that it would have taken much longer to even take a step. Only someone's voice managed to tear the air and reach the man standing at the very epicenter of this incident. He was shouting, trying to warn the deputy, telling him to be careful. Except it was too late. The man was completely surrounded by a swarm of insects that swirled him with them in a dance of death, and for a moment he wasn't even visible because of the huge bodies. When the cockroaches stopped clumping like that, the skeleton of the deputy showed up. Not a hint of skin, or at least muscles and internal organs. It was literally sucked off in a couple of minutes, like people suck the rest of the meat off animal bones, leaving nothing. It was just a shock. It was impossible to foresee, but he could not be saved. And it was definitely worth it to protect ourselves, so the rest of the squad became back to each other in a circle and opened fire on the creatures, wishing them to die. The captain asked not to do anything stupid or waste supplies for nothing. He decided to do the following: let everyone run away and he would try to hold off the insects, thus risking his life. Liu understood that the man wanted to sacrifice himself, but here a sharp pain went through his body from the middle of his chest. When he looked at himself, he saw a cockroach's foot that went through his body. Afterwards he shifted his gaze to the captain. The guy was dragged behind him, screaming for the others to run and not even think about trying to save him. He wasn't alive anyway, and there was no telling how long he would die because of this. He was grabbed by a huge cockroach the size of a multi-story building. It hung over the security team like a sinister monster, and one hit from it would be enough to kill everyone in that squad. The captain looked at the infernal beast with anger. He clenched his teeth and realized that now the last seconds of his life may have come, but he must try to fight back against this monster. Cockroaches were looming. Lo and behold, one such scum ran in one of the unfamiliar places. Lu Renjia instantly swatted at it with a hefty palm, aiming for its rib cage to be sure to give the insect no chance to stay alive. He hadn't yet realized that somewhere not too far away there was a real =1 of this kind of critter, so the guy was just surprised at how huge the cockroaches were here. The man with the scarred face didn't try to deviate from his original plan, so he looked at his team and ordered them to leave before it was too late, and he would try to hold them off. He got into a firm stance and mildly took his large axe. He wasn't ready to give up. You have to at least try a little to wrestle his right to life from this mutant. But his team, not really in a hurry to follow orders and run away from a place where they could all die. They were worried about the man at their head, and it was completely understandable that the man had no chance to save his life. Almost immediately he too was pierced through by a nasty spiked paw, but he had at least a hope. Though foolish and reckless, blood spurted from the gruff fountain. The guys shot back as best they could. For goodness sake, they had machine guns with them, which allowed them to catch up a bit in speed with the insects. But things were still their nasty selves. The cockroaches were getting bigger and bigger, and if things continued like this, they would simply die before they could even say goodbye to life. But then one of them heard silence from the other. He turned to his friend and asked why he was frozen like a statue, ordering him to immediately take up his weapons and continue the fight. Tears came out on the young lad's face. They now had a problem that put their lives in great danger. That's when the second one dropped his machine gun, right in the middle of the inferno itself, which was, to put it mildly, very, very bad timing. They had no shells left, a disaster of massive proportions. The partner asked what to do, though the other guy himself didn't know what the solution to the situation might be. He changed his face and convulsively swallowed his saliva, pressing his lips together harder, preparing himself for the fact that it was time to accept the fact that they were no longer residents. And then he turned to Ziyu and asked him to listen to him very carefully. He was very sorry that he had to face such a thing in his first sortie, and would most likely have to die. The guy pulled out a grenade and added that even at the risk of his life, the guards must deliver what they need, and that's their job, at any cost. With tears in his eyes, his interlocutor replied that he understood everything, as much as he did not want to be dragged into all this now, much less be condemned to death. So when he heard the order that if he understood everything, let him get the hell out of here, he did not challenge it, and in order to fulfill his order, hurriedly took his fee, and with him all the things, while the second guy remained, obviously with the intention of sacrificing himself as well. He spread his arms and appealed to the whole swarm of bugs to walk faster towards him, the bait but for them the sacrifice they had been longing for all this time. He was offering to test them to see how good his meat was. There was a huge amount of explosives under his cloak, but his fiery speech ended with the huge mutant, the head of the cockroaches, crushing him with his paw and not stopping his journey. The boy ran away in tears, remembering that he had also lost his third sibling, with whom he had become very close during all this time. He didn't have the energy to run anymore. He was already tired before, and now it was even worse, but he had to do it. He was so immersed in his thoughts that he didn't notice he had run past the man. But then he still paid attention to this stranger with his side vision. He didn't understand where he was and what was going on. And now Ziyu had some questions for this person as well. He asked the guy if he was from the guards, and Lu Renjia replied that he was. So he introduced himself and added that he was the strongest guard of the Black Iron stage. And the boy was happy about it. He shoved a bag into the hands of his new acquaintance, which surprised him. He introduced himself in response as Yu Ming's security guard from Yu Tang's firm, and he strongly requested to complete the case instead of them, otherwise the items would not be delivered yet. The guy explained that he was the last survivor, the undead that was about to catch up. It had killed even a silver-level commander. He asked the stranger to let Yu Tang rely on him and just run. And by all means, he must get the materials to the suburbs. Lu Renjia's eyes flared again, his hair turning into a flame of fire, and he asked to wait with requests and conclusions. The courier set aside his huge box and looked at the cockroach to see what size enemy he had to overcome. The guy was gathering all his strength and tuning in for the fight, for another victory, in which he was incredibly confident. But this fight hadn't even started. Lu Renjia was able to subdue the mutant without even touching it, the remains of the cockroach falling from a great height to the floor. And now, shifting into his usual form, the guy apologized for not quite concentrating on Yu Tang's words and asked to repeat what had just been said. Thanks to people like this guy, humanity still exists to this day. The guy who was helpless in this whole situation thanked Lu Renjia for his help, then asked for one more favor to come back with him. The guy will definitely report the incident, after which he will pay. The courier, who pretended to be a Black Iron master, said he didn't need the payment. After sending the things, let him keep the money better. And instead of all this, let him show the wanderer the way, for he is a little lost, and he has been walking and wandering about for days, looking for a way. There was a hot news in the town. The main source of fire in Lunshan, the strongest in the platinum level, Shulo, was missing. This shocked the surrounding people. This seemed simply impossible up to this point, something no one in this city or the rest of the world had expected. The wanted photo showed Lu Renjia's altered state, and people began to whisper, speculating whether it was true. Since there had been no news from the Alliance for almost a year, the person who is only capable of destroying Chanfu with just one hand quietly died somewhere. Yes, such a thing can't happen. Who is even capable of defeating him? The crowd was actively discussing without noticing someone else. Still, the hunch that he was just lurking somewhere arose in their heads, except that no one would have thought he would be so close to them, literally behind their backs. Suddenly, Lu Renjia was roughly pushed by someone from behind, ordering him to move forward instead of standing still. The three insolent men warned that it was better to step back and not block their way, and the guy at first didn't understand at all what was the matter and why resort to such actions. Soon, a man in a business suit came over and recognized Lu Renjia as the so-called strongest of the Black Iron Guards, and then wondered if he also cared about Su Luo, and if it's real, he offered to fight him. This did not once startle the guy being addressed. He only snorted ostensibly and headed forward, saying that it was hard to say whether the enemy would prevail, but that a draw would not be difficult, and said that his companions could chat for the time being while he took the task. Men behind his back began to indignant, because he is only a scum of Black Iron, and says such things, it became funny from such nonsense, does not think that he considers himself the navel of the earth, and advised such a connoisseur not to hurry with conclusions. Lu Renjia was very sorry, although you couldn't tell from him, because the people mock him saying he was too crazy. Meanwhile, he laughs at others who don't notice anything. Anyway, he was missing, but even now he could win without fighting. He had been taunted that they had seen brazen men before, but that such men were rare, few were so thoughtless. He remembered his new acquaintance showing him the way, where the east side of Tianfu is. It is located near a village called Manhwa. Therefore, in order not to attract attention, it is better to take the mission that leads to the east. Meanwhile, a female voice announced that there was the newest Black Iron level security recruitment mission. The destination was the east side. The guy wasn't interested at all. He was more concerned with his thirst at the moment, even though the topic being discussed was just what he needed. This time it's a mission to escort the employer, that is, Mr. Yurong, needs to be escorted to Manhwa village, which is east of the center. However, this mission has special requirements. It's not just the employer who needs to be escorted. She left a little intrigue. Her hand reached for the fabric and grasped it, pulling it off in a sharp motion. It is still necessary to bring the tenant's living compartment to integrity. Due to certain circumstances, Mrs. Yurong must not leave the cabin she is in. But no one cared about the task anymore. They saw what they wanted to see, big breasts. Men began to go crazy, many registering immediately, others beating the place out with their fists and convictions that they were the ones who could handle it and no one else. And then the girl spoke, addressing those to whom drool from excitement had flooded their brains. She expressed her gratitude for the men checking in, but there was one but. She touched the glass of her flask. Yurong warned that one shouldn't accept a mission without thinking things through. It was too careless and very dangerous. The Manhwa village she was heading to was located in a mountain forest. There was no road to get there, so the person would have to carry the living quarters. So you need a very strong bodyguard. Someone realized that does not fit this description, so asked if a sentinel is needed, dropping the price to more affordable, just to be present next to the beauty. And then someone's hand touched the glass, creating a thud. Lu Renjia almost stuck to the flask and interrogated about Yurong's direction and whether it was definitely Manhwa village, and then explained that there was no need to recruit so many people. He convinced that it was worth relying on him alone, and it would be enough. And the girl was startled by such an unexpected, impudent person. At this event, as if it were an auction, there was shouting and active conversations. Then the girl who announced the list of available orders asked the bodyguards not to go on stage without permission, so it was better to stand in the crowd. And the men under the wall chanted, ordering the stranger to get out of the stand as fast as possible. Someone even threw something at the guy. Now the laborers were discussing what Lu Renjia had said, that he and one would be enough. It was a famous peculiar trick, thanks to which you can get a nice girl. So the bald man started yelling for someone to give him a try because he was very strong and could handle it alone too. This daredevil came on stage dressing the glass space and told Lu Renjia to get down. It's none of his business anymore. The living container barely lifted off the floor by one edge. A shriek of heaviness was heard. Even though the bald big guy could only lift a flask a little, the others were already admiring it, shouting about the incredible power. The veins on his face were puffed up and sweat was coming out, but he still said that it was just a bit heavy. And despite that, he said that it was fine. No matter how many months it took, he would definitely deliver Miss Yurong alone. And the girl asked to wait on the decision. It shouldn't have taken that long, and for the sake of argument she said she hadn't mentioned that there should only be one guard. And then the bald man had something crunch and then a terrible pain in his back, and Lu Renjia was standing behind him, grinning evilly. The guard's lower back was now sore and wouldn't go away as quickly as it could, but the other gawkers couldn't believe that the big guy had fallen to the floor, thinking he was faking it, and it couldn't just be retaliation. The man claimed that something had definitely hit him, which of course no one believed, and Lu Renjia whistled quietly to the side, knowing whose hand it was. Lu Renjia voiced her worries for the daredevil who got hurt because of her. Then the courier, who had already offered his candidacy before, reminded that he did not renounce his words, asked the lady to relax because he was the strongest black iron bodyguard, that the manager who was in charge of recruiting the employee, and she too doubted the strength of the candidate. Even a security guard with a lot of physical strength would not be able to cope. The crowd became outraged too, because they didn't want to hear about his antics, demanded he get out immediately. Someone convinced the guy that if he could lift it the other would eat the can, called him skinny as a clothespin. So Lu Renjia agreed to this arrangement and turned to Madam. If he could move Lu Renjia out the door, she would leave the job to him, and asked if she was okay with that arrangement. And the girl replied that if he really could, she would agree, but she still didn't believe he could, or he was too big a fool. Lu Renjia accepted this agreement and turned to everyone present with a caustic smile. He ordered everyone disperse and make way for the real bodyguard, and immediately flipped the flask on its side and let it skid across the floor and rolled towards the exit, the girl inside her before she even realized what was happening. Everyone started screaming and running away, because there was no way to hide from such a huge thing. Lu Renjia wasn't particularly happy about this right either. Nausea was starting to catch up with her and everything in front of her eyes was tumbling. And so the portable house was already near the threshold of the exit, to which it rolled very quickly. The girl tried to come to her senses. She rubbed her face with her hand, closed her eyes, just so she wouldn't throw up. But the main thing she cared about was whether the cabin survived. Lu Renjia jumped on the container, asked not to worry, everything is fine, and then asked about her opinion, whether he managed to fulfill the agreement, and Lu Renjia began to resent, calling the courier a scoundrel, because this is not the job of security, except that there is no turning back. The men were furious. They demanded the mistress be returned immediately. They accused him of nearly crushing a good half of those present. He was in their eyes just a bastard. But Lu Renjia was only amused by this. There seemed to be few here who were happy with such a decision of his, and his new traveling companion warned with a serious look that he would soon wait to settle scores with him. And then the guy started to lift the ropes. Lu Renjia was already anticipating something not so good, so she asked him to stop as soon as possible. But the guy did not understand this request, because they had an agreement, and, in fact, he was not going to do anything like that. Then the container with the men inside rose into the air, and the men standing in the crowd were just speechless, in complete shock at what was happening. Lu Renjia easily lifted the portable dwelling behind his back and went on his way, as if it were an ordinary unheavy backpack, not a vessel that even the strongest candidate present couldn't lift. He realized the attention he was causing by such an act, looked at the pretty young lady on his shoulders and said it was time for them to go. Lu Renjia looked at him with confusion. She couldn't believe that a guy who didn't look strong enough to lift such a heavy thing with ease could carry it. The road ahead was long and difficult, over winding trails, mountains and plains, over steep slopes and deep hollows, wading through bushes and trees. Suddenly, terrible birds appeared in the sky, their eyes glowing with anger, and they attacked, putting sharp talons in front of themselves. Lu Renjia sat in her glass shelter and screamed for them not to approach or touch her, terror gripping her. But in reality they turned out to be just regular birds, normal-sized. They weren't mutants, and they weren't going to kill. But that was already enough for the girl to start nagging the guy about how he shouldn't just go, demanding that he figure something out quickly. Lu Renjia didn't understand why there was such panic and worrying if these were just ordinary animals and there was no reason for such a commotion. And the mistress kept whining, saying it's easy for a guy to talk about it all, and they're so damn annoying. So she demanded to help her get rid of them, but even here the guy decided to get an advantage for himself. If a girl wants him to get rid of them, she has to answer a couple of his questions, and they obviously won't be the easiest ones. And the question was the reason why Lu Renjia needed to get to Manhwa City. Mistress turned away and didn't want to answer, so she tried to turn away. She reminded him that the courier would be rewarded once he got her there safely, and Lu Renjia became indignant because, based on the rules and responsibilities of the community, the guy wasn't allowed to ask such questions. And then Lu Renjia decided to talk in a different way. hinting that it would be faster to get to the city if the girl was rolled off the road. The mistress started screaming that the courier was just abusing her and she would complain to the community. Lu Renjia raised the flask higher, swung the container, and explained that he just wanted to increase the efficiency of their journey. And it worked. Yurong told her that she had to meet with the doctor to start her treatment. The courier was surprised at this turn of events. The lady replied that she had heard that this doctor lives secluded in the city of Manhwa. They say that he just has incredible medical skills and that he is good at healing hard-to-treat cases. If her situation interests him, he can even provide free help. Lu Renjia tried to think it over carefully. There were two guys standing under the ruins discussing this situation. There aren't many white and silver ranked escorts in the world. Xinyan heard from him that something went wrong as he awakened. He ended up saying that a famous doctor living in seclusion gave him treatment and it was completely free. After that he disappeared. Guy wondered if there was any research about awakening abilities. I've never heard of this man out there. The interlocutor laughed. Who cares if Lu Renjia is just a dark hire? And then remembering what he'd done to him, he started making excuses and substituting words. Also the man said that he was a white and silver level escort. Only he in that case comes to mind. The guy didn't think it would happen in such a place. And Lu Renjia now remembered the details. The girl began to warn of danger from behind and asked why he was still looking ahead. Sharp claws showed and were ready to smash into the glass. The courier set the flask aside and grabbed his attacker's paw. His gaze was determined and portentous of danger. The terrifying beast didn't want to give up its prey either. And yet Lu Renjia managed to outplay the infernal monster and put it to bed. He asked the girl in the flask about whether Yurong was okay. Immediately, he noticed a crack in the glass. Now the guy really didn't know what to do. But then something happened. The girl just started to burn. The heat made her sweat. Lu Renjia did not expect this, so he asked if the lady was okay. This was not a reaction of the normal body. Her skin began to glow with small fires, but they didn't burn her body. Yurong's capsule started to crack. The girl realized what was happening and the courier started yelling at her. Not understanding where she could get such an unreliable capsule, it easily broke when she merely rolled it. Mistress was embarrassed by such a thing, so she asked to be forgotten and demanded to just leave. Lu Renjia remained silent. He couldn't do such a thing. It was his assignment, so he just silently waited to see what would happen next. Then the glass made a cracking sound, and here and there shatter. There was nothing to be done. One could not even try, and it was better not to get very close, just to keep oneself intact. It didn't last long. Very soon the shards flew in different directions, and around the madam appeared a nice hot aura. The guy immediately rushed to her. Yurong still insisted that Lu Renjia should get her feet away as quickly as possible, because one could see with the naked eye how she was burning up faster and faster, and her clothes began to burn right on her body, and the girl could no longer control it. And then her near hysteria was calmed by the cold water spilling directly onto the top of her head and running down her hair and face. Lu Renjia saw what was happening and it was he who poured the water from his thermos, assuming it would be enough. And now it was clear to him that his awakened ability. The girl just exploded on the spot, yelling at the guy and asking him if she hadn't just told him to run away from here. And he covered himself with his hands in an attempt to shield his face. Yurong was now cursing herself. It was now too late to do anything anyway. The courier's eyes displayed all the light from the tons of flame, the heat whipping around, terror in his eyes. The grass around him caught fire and the fire, like a river, began to spill around in a raging river. This fire could not be stopped. It was too late, and now all that was left to do was to think of what to do to keep from burning themselves. A wave of another explosion, only now fiery, went through the neighborhood as if a dragon was being born to create the apocalypse. Yurong was burning like a torch, screaming in pain, but the flames didn't stop, only becoming more furious, just like the beasts of hell when their kin was killed. The girl couldn't believe it had happened. Again, she had done it again, even though she had told him to run away. Madam was worried that if this continued, the fire would engulf all the mountains in the area, and if there was a village nearby, there would be sheer terror. She needed to find a way out immediately, but she was completely clueless on how to control this. Lu Renjia came closer, and would absolutely agree that the flames were indeed growing very fast, and they really needed to find a way out, and as fast as possible. But Yurong was even more incomprehensible. She was engulfed in fire, but why was the courier unhurt? not a scratch at all. Such a thing was simply impossible, and he had written it off to the fact that he had already talked about being the strongest black iron courier. But that also didn't mean that he wasn't capable of being a little scared. But finding an idea on how to solve everything was indeed very necessary, or else there wouldn't be many deaths. And Lu Renjia has come up with something, and now it's worth at least trying, as they say. He held his breath for a second and tried to focus on his inner feelings as red energy immediately traveled down his sleeve. Thus he activated the scarlet armor, causing a small hurricane, a gust of wind around. This allowed her to touch the mistress with her hands, and she asked in surprise not to be touched, which was rather absurd in the situation that was going on. But this request was not honored, and in response, so that Yurong would not be alarmed, Lu Renjia said that if he did not touch her, how they would get to the city together, but as it turned out, that was not what the girl was talking about, and then asked if her carrier was offended. That one didn't answer, only stomped his foot on the ground, pushing through it from such power in his legs and energy arriving to his body. Yurong already realized what was happening and asked to wait at least a little bit, but it was already pointless to stop him. Lu Renjia pushed himself off the floor very abruptly and zipped between the trees. It was impossible to see him, only the trail that was left behind. And then they were somewhere near a body of water opposite the mountains. That's when the courier started to brake with his feet, only to stop where he needed to. And now Yurong realized what was about to happen, and she absolutely hated the idea. But before she could even move to get off her hands, in a flash she was in the air. Lu Renjia tossed her out into the middle of the body of water. You could hear her screaming in the distance and see her whirling her legs around as if there was a chance of taking off and not getting wet. The girl squelched into the water, making a huge splash upwards, the water making her squeeze her eyes shut and hold her breath as fast as possible. The guy kept standing there and just waiting to see what would happen, to see if she could fade and get back to normal. There was steam reaching the surface and escaping outward, indicating that the hot stuff had just cooled down. Except it didn't quite work out the way it should. Suddenly, there was an underwater explosion that let up such a cloud of haze that it was impossible to see what was happening on that side of the lake. The multi-eyed mutant fish jumped out and hit the guy right on the forehead. So this technique is quite effective. Anyway, the whole lake was already starting to boil from that degree. The smoke went up, rising to cloud level. Yurong, who came out of the water, was still burning, but it was already easier. She was only a little wet. The flames still didn't dry off her skin, even though she no longer had any clothes on. She was completely burned. As the steam went higher and higher, the lad asked the lady how she was, and whether she was well, for it was rather risky, not knowing whether a man could swim, to throw him into the water. The water was already incredibly hot. In such water you can jump in winter with a bomb, and after that you will not want to go out into the cold air, instead of waves on the surface or clouds created artificially. Yurong was all wet, and finally replied that she was more or less fine, then swam closer to the shore from which she had just flown away. Lu Renjia had to take off his outer clothing. The temperature on land was also rising, and he had to cover his ward's naked body with something to keep her breasts from shining. The courier didn't demand an explanation right now, but still the girl decided to start this conversation, forcing the guy to come out of his state of immersion in his thoughts. When her body comes in contact with the environment, her skin temperature starts to rise rapidly, and at some point things reach a tipping point where there is nowhere else to increase. She looked at her hand, the fingers of which were still burning in the flames, and after a brief pause she returned to the thought of her body burning after the critical point. The longer the time, the higher the temperature, and the harder it was to extinguish the flames. Lu Renjia carefully delved into this explanation and highlighted the information for himself. And then the guy finally realized that the power of flame was at least gold level and a good enough ability that not all strong heroes were able to control it. The girl didn't answer at first, throwing her head back, dipped into the water harder, cooling down absolutely completely. She wished she hadn't thought about anything but just rested properly now. And then she focused on the topic her traveling companion had brought up, which made her eyes widen. She pondered about the gold rank. Once, Yurong lived in a village far in the west. Demonic beasts attacked it all year round. Houses would burn. They wouldn't be rebuilt before a new attack started, and still had to rebuild everything. They fed on their food and attacked the inhabitants, not sparing a single person in the neighborhood. Were real monsters. Once the inhabitants took up arms before the disaster to resist the demonic creatures, although they did not know how to do it properly and what awaits them. That the monsters grew stronger and stronger to the point that they became nothing to them. In the end, the head of the village changed the direction to magical medicine. He claimed it would help gain them supernatural powers. But Huang and Wan also died, and they were the prime candidates. The head was addressed by a man. The city gates can no longer hold back the demonic creatures, and now they are making their way here, and after the cure there was no way to survive, which was a huge problem. Time was running out. They only had one dose left in them. Now it was Huan's turn. The old man glanced at the table where a bowl of liquid stood. The man wasn't going to consume it. He figured the head was just kidding. After all, tons of people died after that stuff, and he had a family that needed a breadwinner, so he had no intention of drinking a thing that could kill him. That's when Yurong was brought in, offering her a drink. After all, she was an orphan and had nothing to lose. The village had raised the girl for a long time, so it was time to repay the favor. Her parents had also been killed by demonic beasts, so let her consider it an attempt at revenge. She wanted it so badly after all. The young maiden had nowhere to go, so she agreed to this risk, even though inside everything clenched with fear. She flipped the saucer over with ease, swallowing their key to salvation. Immediately, the container fell to the floor and shattered, splintering into a dozen small shards. Yurong immediately began to burn inside. Letting the fire out, she could no longer hear the questions about her well-being and the words of surprise that she wasn't dead and the questions about whether it meant that she had succeeded. The residents were cruel and inhuman. Even worse than those creatures, they ordered the girl not to be a swagger. The demonic beasts were almost here, so they decided to push her outside, and it was worth hurrying. Yurong was pushed out the door and slammed them shut, trying to calm down, while her old acquaintance was led to her certain death, especially when she couldn't feel normal and realize what was happening to her body. The villagers only wished them good luck from behind the closed door, reminding them that the girl was the only and last hope of their village, and in front of this innocent victim already stood a huge cockroach, ready to smear her, no matter how ridiculous it was, like a little bug. Yurong was as if she was gravely ill, with a fever, sweat streaming down her face, the firelight bursting through her skin. It was very hard to breathe. She couldn't believe that she had been treated like this. Ditch, made a scapegoat, cannon fodder, completely unwillingly, the hatred inside her growing and growing. The monster himself froze in front of the girl. It was as if he was deciding whether or not to attack first and if there was any danger in the victim in front of him. The head opened the door ajar and he and those in the house watched everything happen as the fire spread everywhere and they were scared. Yurong immediately exploded with anger, sending everyone who had framed her flying, and a hot beam and dancing flames rose up, covering a huge area, burning everything to the ground. Rings of fire swirled around her. The girl looked dangerous and powerful. No one would dare to get close to her in such a state. She managed to overpower the cockroach. Against her he was just insignificant and pathetic. It seemed any monster in front of her couldn't stand up to her. Yurong looked like a demon that had risen from under the ground, from hell itself. Fire was inside her and outside. Eyes turned into suns in the deserts that burned everything around. With a sad note in her voice, the girl reminded Lu Renjia of his words that such an ability was very suitable for his customer. Everything around was cooling down after her powers. But it was a real torment for her. She still wished she had never drank that potion, so she wouldn't have such a terrible ability. The girl covered her face with her hand, and she said that a simple guy like Lu Renjia couldn't understand how she felt, even though she didn't know everything about the courier sitting next to her. The guy wanted to say something, to reveal his secret, but still decided to keep silent and not give away his secret, even though the girl opened up to him, and why it was so hard for her. Therefore, the so-called Black Iron level courier agreed with this statement without expressing any regret and sympathy for this story, in which, against man's will, he was turned into a weapon against the beasts of hell. He just summed it up about how this is, after all, a fate you can't hide from, so you shouldn't get yourself worked up and try to live with it somehow without worrying and self-eating. Yurong didn't expect such a cold reception of her words and flipped over to face her mercenary, creating circles in the water. She talked about it. He asked if the guy was really just a Dark Iron level escort. Her flames could turn a high-ranked monster into ashes, but there wasn't a scratch on Lu Renjia. That's what led her to suspect a lie. The guy just threw the herb he had just chewed out of his hands, reminding him that he is the strongest. so let him not be surprised. Yu Rong still couldn't believe it. After all, the courier is just as strong as the person who put her in that capsule. There was immense strength in his hands. The madam was all wet. Lu Renjia wasn't in the mood for such a conversation. He can't tell everything, so he thought of how to get off the topic and ignore such a thing. The guy took his jacket to pull the girl closer to him in a stiff motion. Now it was his time to ask questions, and he angrily asked about whether he was the one who told Yu Rong to go to Zhongwu and what he looked like. The girl was shocked at such an unexpected push, but she didn't think it was any secret information, so she answered that he was wearing a gas mask, and she couldn't see his face, so she couldn't give an exact description. He grabbed her neck and Yu Rong was at a loss for words due to the cold air. The stranger told her that she was sick and should head to the city where a certain doctor would help her. And then it stressed her out that Lu Renjia even knew him, and from where. Now she wouldn't let up until she heard the whole truth. But then because the courier had pulled back his cloak too much, the girl's breasts opened and his gaze lowered to them. It was hard to tear his eyes away from the attractive body. The girl realized what the matter was. The fire behind her intensified along with her embarrassment. She blushed and didn't know what to do in such an awkward situation. Flames started coming from everywhere, from his cheeks, from the corners of his eyes. His pupils narrowed and shuddered. The hurricane of flames erupted again, burning everything around them and rising up, increasing the temperature around them. The girl burned the guy's face and jumped into the water with words that Lu Renjia was just a pervert, asking where he was looking just now. She was innocent, and now thinking it was all on purpose, blaming herself for being careless. And in such hysterics she proceeded to explain that she was just in dire need of a capsule at the time, and the stranger had dragged her to the base, left some money to hire an escort, and that was all she knew. Nothing else. While the guy was cooling down, he clarified if there were any strange symbols on him back then, and showed something in the air that could help him remember. But Yu Rong shouted that she didn't know anything because she couldn't notice something she wasn't interested in. Lu Renjia realized that this was a useless conversation, so he asked to hurry up and go immediately to that village to meet this doctor. Yu Rong couldn't grasp the thought of how they would go. How does the guy even imagine it? Without that capsule, her body would be out of the water, and then what to do? That the courier even here was able to come up with some loophole and a way out of such a situation. But there was no other option, so we will have to endure this way. As he walked down the path, a huge barrel rattled on his back and tumbled from side to side. A huge barrel, or something more like a large pot, was tied to Lu Renjia's back, and in it, under the lid, sat Yu Rong, who didn't really like moving around in such a vessel, but it was too late and useless to object. But still, she decided to make a scandal that he had found it at all, and the guy just ordered to be grateful that he had found something at all, and rebuked that madam couldn't imagine where he had to go for it. But Yu Rong kept whining that this basket was shabby, decided that it was such a revenge of the courier, and the guy asked to just put up with such a thing. They would be at the place soon anyway. The girl was indignant at such an attitude towards her, and promised that she would definitely complain about him to the guild, and with such shouting, did not notice that they were already almost there, and could not even consider the beauty of nature around. That the doctor with blonde hair sat on the veranda and admired everything around, admiring the wonderful day, surrounded by chirping birds and fragrant flowers, was just incredibly comfortable. And then his face became caustic and maliciously cunning in appearance. He reassured himself also with the thought that his patient should be arriving soon. They were walking through a desolate place where there wasn't even a single demonic beast. They couldn't believe that this was really a city. Before the disaster, this place wasn't even called a city. A very strange feeling was inside. There were no roads there. Not even creatures could be found. Certainly no one talking about humans. It was somehow highly abnormal and created in Lu Renjia a huge doubt and anxiety inside. Yu Rong now also doubted that the doctor really lived here. She wasn't sure if they were on the right path at all. The guy said not to worry. They weren't wrong. And then he added incidentally that if they had to go around the ruins and look around, it would be a little longer, but not too difficult. But then he got quiet and interrupted their conversation because he saw something. And then it turned out that across the row, in the height below, stood a building that didn't look like the others. It was a live van, more or less well maintained, as if an oasis, a mirage in the middle of the desert, stood here between the abandoned buildings and rubble. Both the courier and the customer felt no relief, only more fear and anxiety, which increased with every second. There were flowers all around, as if there had never been an apocalypse in the world. Everything was shining and bountiful, smelling and taking you away, feeling like you'd gone to paradise. Guy decided to knock on the door, firmly and confidently, loudly, so that whoever was inside would definitely hear about the new guests. They began to wait for an answer, the girl watching everything from her temporary place of residence in the pot. And then she decided to make a sound herself and ask if there was someone inside and why no one was opening or at least answering them. Just then a crowd of men ran out of the door, now that they had reacted to the sound and were wondering who the newcomers were and if they had come to see the doctor. They were welcomed and asked to come in soon, but Lu Renjia didn't want to be in such a hurry. He wanted to scout the situation in more detail and find out what was going on in general. But no one listened to him. They immediately pulled him inside and offered to examine the patients and rather make a diagnosis. Began to ask about the size of clothes, because they were now friends, they said, and should prepare a room for them. They started pressuring the guy, asking if he liked it here, who he wanted to live with and so on, which only added to the stress and did not favor this place in any way. And that one heard someone else's voice. Zero, it was different. It was steady and calm, asking for no no's in the hospital. The doctor stood in front of them. He reminded the patients that this was not the first time he had asked them not to create unnecessary decibels, and asked what had created such a scream this time. The men dressed more like pajamas bowed to him, and informed him that they had a new guest, and Lu Renjia, with the pot already closed behind his back, still didn't understand what kind of chaos was going on here. The doctor smiled sweetly and greeted the visitor. Now it was clear why everyone was so excited. There had been no new faces here for a long time. His name was Lu. He worked in this hospital, extending his hand, asking how he could be of help. Lu Renjia, on the other hand, replied that he was only an escort, and took the heavy load off his shoulders to demonstrate the real patient. The pot fell loudly with its bottom on the floor, and the splashing of water inside was heard. Uranga came out of it, showing not all of her face, and embarrassedly said hello. This particular girl needed help, as her courier explained. Steam was coming off of her from her body heat. The doctor immediately rushed to ask Miss what her problem was, and why she was sitting in a clay jug. This is something you don't see very often. Suddenly the girl stuck out her hand, which was still out cold, and asked the doctor to look at it. Immediately, the limb caught fire with unimaginable fire and glowed like iron in a forge in his hands. The doctor expressed his surprise at such a phenomenon, and his interest in studying the problem. He reasoned that it was a transformation ability. Her skin would become hot at the first contact with the air, and then her body would become inflamed. That was the doctor's assumption, and asked if it was true. And Yurong was in the water because she couldn't control the ability on her own. He added that it could be a consequence of an incomplete awakening due to a poor quality essence. He became very curious from such a case in his practice. Yurong was amazed at how quickly Lu had figured everything out, even though she didn't say anything, only showing her hand. The doctor waved his hand and suggested that we discuss all the details inside, so we wouldn't be stuck outside. One of the guy's sleeves ripped. Muscles that weren't there before showed, veins bulged. The big guy picked up the jug and carried it to the hospital, barely holding it. It was so strange that such a frail guy who was seeing the girl off carried it himself with such ease. And then Lu remembered the escort that remained outside, either waiting to carry the girl back or to free himself and continue on his way. With a sort of evil smirk and suspicious tone, the doctor asked the guy about whether he wanted to be fully checked too, the kind of voice that made goosebumps run down my body. Lu Renjia replied that he didn't need it. He was completely healthy. Then the patient behind him became somber and emitted dark energy. From his bones on his fingers came sharp blades, looking more like claws, like a wolverine's, the kind that could kill and deeply wound anyone. As the courier was gathering his thoughts and was about to go shopping in the towns to see if he could find some souvenirs, he certainly needed it for cover, as this brunette with claws pounced on him from behind, waving his hand and replying that it would never happen and advising him not to go against the doctor from now on. He was rapidly heading towards the guy. He wanted to see how the guy would emit scarlet blood and whether he would change his mind afterwards. And now the weapon was right in front of Lu Renjia's face, but he wasn't going to take a step back, not even the slightest evasion. Immediately, the guy smacked his attacker in the face with something wooden, so that it shattered into tiny knots, causing pain and a terrible feeling to spread across his opponent's face. The man fell to the floor and started whimpering, asking what was wrong with this guy, like he wasn't just about to impale him with his hand. But it wasn't this that Lu Renjia would be outraged about. It was the fact that he had been interrupted. He was also holding slivers in his hands, hinting that he could repeat the trick that had just been demonstrated. Just then a doctor ran out in a panic, who heard the strange noises and sparked over what was going on here. And Consider immediately began berating the patient for being rude to their guest, ordering him to leave immediately, while the courier threw his temporary means of defense out of his hands. The brunette wasn't very happy about this tone, but obediently headed inside the clinic. Chelu apologized to Lu Renjia, asking if his ward had time to harm him. And the escort himself furrowed his eyebrows and was unpleasantly surprised at such enthusiasm, if you could call it that, just because he refused to be examined. The doctor wanted to tear him to pieces. Chelu became visibly nervous, though he tried to suppress this emotion, started to deny that of course not, and discounted the fact that the guest must be joking, justified that he had another reason to ask the guest to stay, and abruptly changed the topic of this conversation, emphasized that these patients have mental disorders and that is why they act impulsively and clumsily. The new patient is an unhappy young lady. That is why he is afraid to leave her with them. And Lu Renjia wanted to be told everything straight, notwithstanding such a presentation of information. The doctor, still in a kind of anxiety, continued to reason that Yurong would also need an escort after the treatment. It was not easy to find an escort in such a remote village, and added that the guest would not find any souvenirs nearby and just like that pushing to stay here. After patting the guy on the back and expressing hospitality, saying that he had some fragrant tea in the hospital, so asked him not to waste Lu Renjia's time looking around. Therefore kindly offered to come in and have a hot drink until the operation was over. And the mug of tea on the table was telling the guy what choice he had made. At first Lu Renjia wanted to avoid it and try to sneak in here as well. And now he didn't understand how he'd gotten here in the first place, and now he was sitting in a chair drinking a warm drink. He thought the long-haired guy was very suspicious, but he can't figure out his true intentions, so it's his duty to try to survey the surroundings a little later. The courier took a sip of tea, which warmed his throat and went down his throat easily. It was a wonderful temperature, just like some cold winter day. But here was the taste. It was strange, because as soon as the guy realized that there was something wrong with the drink, he immediately poured it away, and throwing the mug to the side concluded that in principle this hospital is very suspicious, and here you should not trust neither people nor walls. Lu Renjia rushed forward along the corridor. He couldn't let these people treat Miss Yuran. His gut told him so, which meant he should find the girl as soon as possible, in these white labyrinths. And then he noticed just her, walking down the hallway ahead of him. She immediately rushed towards her, yelling at her back for her to pay attention to him and listen to his point of view on the whole thing. He turned to Miss Yu, asking what she was doing here and shouldn't she be somewhere in the doctor's office. And to top it all off, her body should be on fire. Couldn't Chelu have cured her yet and so quickly? The girl did not turn around and, standing back, she said she was already completely healthy, which was very suspicious. And then she turned around and reached for Lu Renjia with her hand, touching his face, raising some questions that were becoming even more. The girl seemed to be too excited. She said, in a sweet voice, that it was all thanks to only him, Mr. Lu, because he brought her here in time and saved the girl's life. Her face was closer and closer to his. The words came out of her mouth that she didn't even know how to thank the courier for his kindness, though she had thought about it for a long time. It caused immense embarrassment to her interlocutor. With a playful voice, she reached for her clothes and added that she had come to the realization that the only thing she could do was to give her body in return for help. The top of the garment slid neatly down, beginning to bare her large breasts, showing off the manicured pale skin that seemed to glow in the light. Terror descended on Lu Renjia. This was what every man who cried out about wanting to accompany Miss Yurong but not her established escort would want. His hand began to let off energy lightning bolts that he was gathering in his hand because the matter was already smelling fry and getting weirder and weirder. He put his fist to his head and demanded the girl to come to her senses immediately and finally look at everything with fresh eyes. It was like he was trying to get it into her head through his thoughts that that long-haired creep had done it all, even though the guy had been careful, tried to be, all along. And then he finally made no secret of the fact that he realized what was going on. Interrupting this monologue, his eyes became menacing and his body was ready to fight. And by now there were huge paws surrounding him, trapping him, and the floor had turned to water that had been gathered up to the bone. And then he continued with the thought that no matter how much he did, No matter how carefully he stepped on that blade, he still made a mistake and fell for his illusion. Those limbs sprawled all over the place, making nasty squelch-like sounds. Lu Renjia stood in front of huge heads, no mouth eyes, just a huge recess that glowed yellow-orange. They wriggled their bodies and headed straight for the guy below. But it didn't scare him once. He was only happy to meet the souvenirs he'd been looking for so long and couldn't get his hands on in any way. The guy was being watched from a screen that was connected to a camera, and reasoned that he was just an escort, after all. And now he couldn't believe that they really needed to release all the demonic beasts. These people looking into the screen were the two guys who were Chelu's servants, and now seemed to be following their boss's orders. The chubby guy was terrified. He couldn't believe that he would have to release also the very monster that even they were afraid of, even though they were under the doctor's protection. And then the brunette started to get nervous too. He wasn't particularly eager to let that thing out either. Fatty recalled that the doctor himself had said he couldn't determine this guy's strength, which meant it was something incredibly dangerous. And Wolverine vouched that if it didn't get full after they let it out, it wouldn't be his fault at all. But his partner ordered him to shut up and do what he was told to do and not whine on and on. The water looked more and more like a black slurry, like oil ready to suck in and dissolve anyone who stepped on it. Suddenly an incredibly scary creature burst into the room, all black, eyes glowing with terror, and teeth sharper than any knife. He showed them off by opening his huge mouth. He hadn't been fed in a long time. There was a sign above the door that said that behind the walls was the operating room, which was where Yuran was being treated. The girl was shocked that she wasn't on fire, and the doctor told her not to worry. He had implanted a temperature stabilizer in her body. It would temporarily help her control herself. There were a bunch of sensors connected to it, and then the girl suddenly asked Chelu about the whereabouts of the guy accompanying her. This really worried the mistress, and for good reason, as if her gut was telling her that something was wrong. But the doctor wasn't about to tell the whole truth. It would reveal his devious plan. So while tapping something on his control panel, he explained that Lu Renjia had said he had to start the next mission, so he hurried off. But Yuran didn't understand why he did that. If the girl didn't confirm about the completion of the mission, how could he even do that? And the doctor tried to cover it up for his benefit, that maybe the courier would return after completing the parallel mission, and then turned to the girl and asked, to the point, about what she specifically wanted from the treatment. The girl connected to the machines didn't understand the question. She had never thought about it that much, and now it was time to think hard. She thought back to the day she burned not only the monsters in the village, but also the villagers who raised her as an orphan. The girl closed her eyes and thought about the fact that if it was possible, she would like to return to a state before the awakening of her abilities, when she could live a quiet life and not think about touching her surroundings. With a rather wicked smile, the blonde man replied that anything he wanted was possible, and it was no problem at all for him. Suddenly, he uncuffed Yuran and told her not to worry. After Madame woke up, she would feel much better. The girl looked at her hand and couldn't understand what it was and asked Mr. Chelu what it even meant. The same replied with a fake smile that it was necessary so that she wouldn't twitch too much and trash his lap because of pain. And the last words about pain worried Yuran immensely. The girl tried to free herself and asked to wait a second. She would like to wait for her escort before the surgery, but he assured her that everything was fine. And now the doctor no longer tried to hide his real intentions and the fact that he was not doing it out of the kindness of his heart. He pressed a button on the remote and answered the girl that she could join him when the treatment was finished, but would do it in hell. The girl began to bend on the couch and scream in terrible pain. She was being electrocuted. The electricity penetrated every cell of her body. Everything from her arms to her lungs trembled. It stunned tremendously. Suddenly something stirred in the flask. It began to bubble and oscillate. The doctor laughed out loud. She was visited by crazy thoughts. He knew for sure that this would benefit them greatly, that this was the key to a new world, and one must do it again. He must fulfill what he had planned. Sparks of fire lit up in her eyes. She didn't understand why she was back in a place she shouldn't have been. She had been set up again. As a child, children were taken away from her by their own parents, telling them that they shouldn't even go near her. She caused the death of her parents, and asking the child to intimidate them. They don't want their mom and dad to die too. When she got a little older, stones flew at her and the girl was kicked, accusing her of looking like a libertine and being the one to seduce someone else's man. And after all that, they were forced to make her drink the potion, knowing that several people had died from it, and covered it up by saying that she was their last hope and that no one else could handle it. Yuron didn't understand why she had to go through all that. She had done nothing wrong. The doctor reasoned about the documents provided by that gentleman and that they turned out to be true, and only wanted to repeat about what he needed to do next. But then his kind of patient rushed in, needing a couple of free seconds from Mr. Chelu. The girl, meanwhile, was grabbing the jacket of her escort and asking for help from someone else, her body getting hotter and hotter. But she was no longer hurt even by her tormentors. They were scandalized. The doctor was asking about whether he had not told the brunette that he was not allowed to enter the lab, and the latter asked him to listen. It was about the escort. And already Chelu was very interested in the matter and demanded not to procrastinate, and say what about that guy. But before he could say another word, the wall broke through and stones flew in different directions. Lu Renjia almost flew in and tried to strike, although he was held back by the monster, wrapping his arms and legs with vile tentacle paws. The guy wished that those who had harmed Yuron would disappear. The infernal creature was heading straight for the guy, wanting to finish him off. He was quite close. Just a little more and everything would have come to fruition in favor of the scum doctor. The monster tried to pounce with great speed and thus kill the enemy. But the courier wasn't going to wait for the moment to be turned into a tortilla either, so he took a stronger grip on the infernal beast to finish what he had started. With an easy motion he snapped the monster's legs in half, without a drop of any fear, sympathy, or mercy, cold-bloodedly. It was common for him to kill mutants so that its eyes wouldn't twitch. Lu Renjia tossed his paw aside and, standing covered in blood, looked toward the doctor and the guy in pajamas, hinting that their plan had long since gotten out of hand. And Chelu was ordering his subordinate not to stand a pillar and already start doing something, such as punching the opponent, and the brunette turned into a big man, took in his shirt, and was already ready to carry out the order. Spikes began to crawl out of his skin, all over his body. As it turned out, he didn't just have them on his arms, which could have been frightening, and such a form was his true form. From his shoulders, arms, eyebrows, and back protruded needles like a porcupine. His body covered in bone spikes, creating a perfect balance of defense and attack, and now he himself was wondering how the courier was going to win. But immediately, he was interrupted by a huge hand appearing from the floor, which grabbed the brunette in a fist and squeezed very hard. The doctor jumped back, and Lu Renjia did not even flinch, as if he knew it was going to happen. The boy screamed in fear. He had never been so close to such sharp teeth before, and his spikes didn't help much in this situation. And the courier just looked at them questioningly, asking if this wasn't their demonic beast that they were controlling and manipulating. And now the mutant had bitten off the head of that modernized porcupine that had made such a show of itself in front of Lu Renjia, to which the courier advised Chelu to choose a pet that was more docile next time. At the screams and sounds of concrete breaking, the others ran over as well, and the blonde man only said that he knew so and so knew that this monster was unusual. Luckily for them, they let it out right away. However, it's worth considering how to lock the monster back in, but of course after the escort is dead, and the infernal beast has already lunged with open mouth at the guy, showing off a couple rows of its teeth. But the lad was not afraid. He dodged once, leaping upward from the hand that was so intent on seizing him, and then he was already jumping, kicking his foot away from the nasty creature's body and up to pull one trick. Lu Renjia blew the hell beast's head off with one swing of his leg. Blood rushed from its neck, and now there was no need to worry. Everything was safe. The head rolled back far enough to the three occupants of this polyclinic for them to see it and give themselves time to realize what had just happened. The doctor and all his rats were in complete shock at what was happening. They didn't expect that this guy could so easily deal with a monster that couldn't be dealt with by the strongest. Lu Renjia landed on the floor, holding the body with a fist that broke through the floor, letting cracks spread across it. He was trying to teach these scum a lesson that they should understand the full consequences of their actions. He looked at them with a menacing stare that right away would have made anyone tell everything they knew, do whatever they were ordered to do, and the like. And the girl lay already almost unconscious. There was a harsh noise in her head. She heard only distant voices, as if their owners were underwater or in mountains strewn with snow. Sweat ran down her face from the heat. Lu Renjia's eyes lit up with anger. He wasn't going to let these scum get away with attacking the escort parcel. And then Chelu was surprised by such an expression. Hence he decided to interrogate about it. What did the package mean? if it was definitely a gift from that gentleman. He clung to his subordinates again and demanded them not to stand still and do something urgently, though he realized how it would all end. Most likely and the guys wanted to object, except that the boss didn't care at all. His eye seemed to glitter with danger, and he ordered his underlings to shut up and take the courier immediately. Now it could be realized that the man had conceptual powers. The two ambassadors were coming at him with all the anger and readiness to finish him off. And then Lu Renjia's fist clenched tighter, and the big guy realized that he wasn't going to be very pleased, so he slowed down his speed. Lu Renjia punched his opponent in the face with his fist, not giving him a chance to fight back. He was unbearably strong. It seemed that if he pushed a little more, his victim would fly into the wall and penetrate it, while behind him the second thug was already trying to attack. But even here the courier outplayed them, and had already clenched his hand to strike the other one as well. But his fist wasn't ready yet. It was worth Lu Renjia's closing his fingers as the man in the air exploded with blood. And not even getting an inch closer to his enemy now wouldn't work. It was just a corpse. The doctor, seeing that his men were spread out like little snot-nosed girls, began to press on his boots and run as fast as he could. But Lu Renjia didn't care about that. He picked up his cape, which that one had taken out with Yurong, and covered the girl with it. He listened and realized that she was still breathing. She must be all right. The mistress lay unconscious and did not react to the slightest touch. The guy turned towards the evil genius, who at his own risk had not yet managed to get away, and with a stern look that sent sparks from his pupils asked Chelu how he dared to do such a thing to his ward. So let him not even think about running away. But he only laughed madly and, taking the syringe, the needle of which seemed to glow in the light of the lamp, said that he had no intention of escaping. And since his experiment had already been completed, there was nothing to lose. He was completely distraught, and now he would do anything to finish the experience. And the new material would be exactly Lu Renjia, since he had failed with the girl. They stoically faced each other. Neither one made a move towards the other. Except that Chelu had no intention of doing such a thing. He had his own plan for this battle. Don stuck the needle from the syringe into his neck and laughed like a true madman without adequacy in his head. He was anticipating what was going to happen to him right now. As soon as the drug entered inside, blood and pain rushed down his throat, but the doctor was not frightened or even alarmed. He was ready to endure such a small thing to come to his original goal. Although the course of the plan changed a little, but Lu Renjia didn't find it funny or amusing. For the first time a seed of doubt and thoughts about what to do began to dawn on him, and not as usual, without panic, and his heart began to beat a little faster. The explosion was powerful. It boomed very loudly and blew apart a good portion of the building, which still looked like it was in the middle of this abandoned stone jungle. The courier jumped up to avoid burning his clothes. The floor was engulfed in flames and one must secure himself and his mercenary as quickly as possible. On the run, he grabbed the girl in his arms and rushed forward, watching for any suitable escape routes without flames, and it wasn't easy to do that in a sprawling operating room. He looked at his opponent and clearly recognized the power that had now been applied. His eyes also lit up with magical energy. It seemed at last at least a somewhat worthy opponent, and the guy wouldn't mind a battle like this, but not at the hands of an innocent lady. The doctor was ablaze with hellfire, and judging by the expression on Lu Renjia's face, assumed that he was surprised, and confirmed the speculation that he could copy the girl's power and the man then would definitely know the proper use of this ability, at least for now. The flames parted slightly and the hero was faced with an almost completely desiccated image of a man with a disfigured face. He explained that the human gene has more than 3 million base pairs, so the random awakening of the same ability is nothing short of a miracle. Chelu wanted to copy the existing ability by transplanting the awakened part of the gene from the awakened bodies into their bodies, but this brilliant idea was rejected by the organization. Everyone looked out on him. They said that someone had done similar experiments a long time ago and that it was impossible, and the only one who believed him was the master. Not only did he give him the data of past experiments, but he even helped him find materials for his tests, and Chelu finally succeeded. His further plan and motive were clear. As long as he continued to copy the ability, no one would dare to look down on him. But it seemed to Lu Renjia that such a reason was just stupid, incredibly stupid, to create utter chaos and inhumane acts for the sake of proving his lack of talent. While he was asking the doctor about what the true purpose of his organization was, he noticed that Yurong wasn't burning and wondered why. if before her body was immediately glowing and igniting from the slightest contact with the air. Lu explained that he had injected her with a body temperature inhibitor, a secret formula of their organization, and this was the kind of discovery the courier found truly useful, not what the scientist was doing just now. But you can't talk teeth to a doctor like that. The man asked how someone like his interlocutor could understand their nobility. And then Lu Renjia noticed that the fire had already started grabbing at his clothes with its tongues. Tapping him on the shoulder to keep himself from catching fire completely, he replied with a completely incredulous look that no one would believe such a thing about. Maybe he too would like to join their organization. And the scientist was quite amused by this. He replied that the courier was not worthy to join them. All he could be was only material to implement experiments. That was the only thing the guy could do for their organization. But suddenly, that vile worm that Lu Renjia had defeated not too long ago in front of everyone's eyes pounced on its master, wrapping its body as tightly as possible. Suddenly, his body began to feel as if it was grafting onto the monster's body. Like hot wax melting and joining with the hell beast's tough skin, it caused him to be shocked and not understand what was happening. He became a real candle that had been burning for hours. Everything was literally dripping off him, melting like plasticine, and there was nothing to be done. Something was clearly wrong. This was not part of the evil doctor's plans. That the terrible beast began to devour not only him, but also the assistants of the scholar. Lu himself shouted and screamed that he could not be wrong and his theory could not be wrong, erroneous. He followed the data of the master, studying them well. But Lu Renjia didn't care as much as possible about what was going on now. He decided to teach this madman a lesson that the man now knew why others said it was impossible. And he himself had fallen for the cheap hope the other man had given him. Despite the fact that everything around was burning and the doctor could observe the whole picture himself, still being a direct participant, he could not still accept about the unreality of such an experiment. He had literally turned into a huge lump of wax that was now dissolving with the same burned and skinless body of his prepositioned dog in the form of a spiked man. He still thought it was just a minor setback, as if he didn't realize that he was about to be finished. He thought he could fix something if he changed the formula or the materials, but it was useless to change anything anymore. All that was left of him was his skull and a mouth-filled cavity. And Lu Renjia hastened to disappoint his opponent by saying that this was not just a mishap, and he had already encountered something familiar in a fight with giant apes in the not-too-distant past, and he would not hurt his soul in front of the almost dead professor. The man grabbed his head, which was not all at home. He was delirious, yelling for the interlocutor not to carry this nonsense. This is all not true and cannot end like this, which is simply impossible. But only after so much time it began to reach him. Now his grief was voiced. He was finally able to come to the realization that he himself was an experiment. And while he thought he was the puppeteer, his strings were being pulled just as hard and not really hiding it. He was coping with convincing himself that it was all great luck. Everything was on fire. Lu was already burning, and his mind kept wondering how this was all possible. His torment continued, which only made him more mad. But Lu Renjia was not going to give the scoundrel a chance to die without saying anything, so he asked not to be discouraged, as if mocking the scientist, and asked, well, he could think, to tell the purpose of the silent walker, and then the guy may still be able to save him. But the doctor's rotten soul and banal stupidity was seemingly stronger than the desire to live. And he began his words by saying that he had already changed his mind. At first it seemed that here it was, the truth, but then Lu added that he now thought that his opponent was unworthy to be even material, and all these words with a tremendously caustic smirk, as if he was the one now standing in his human form. Lu Renjia noticed the changes around him, and the course of events did not please him. It was a bit unexpected. He thought he could reach an adequate compromise. But then there was a huge release of fire energy and everything spun in a flaming tornado, after which the monster sent the courier to hell. He laughed wickedly at the fact that his opponent had bought it, and promised to burn him, so that not even ashes would remain. And in such a fire that was around it was indeed possible to roast the Lord of Hell himself to a golden crust. The already completely disfigured skeleton of a doctor asked, shouting about how the escort dared to question the relationship between Master and Lu, added once again that the latter was not worthy of being material and wished him to burn in hell. But he had the wrong person when he called the scientist a complete bastard. Lu Renjia opened his eyes wide and they glowed a bright yellow color that broke through even the flames in front of him. His fingers were covered in claws, becoming one with the gloves. They were not afraid of fire. Nothing was beyond the control of this material. Immediately the guy rushed towards the mutant, saying that he was completely out of his mind, and rebuking him for not being so careless and stupid. And the already almost burnt-out man couldn't understand what was happening now. The impact was such that the infernal beast flew back into the wall, breaking through it, almost completely merged with the beast. The doctor screamed in fear and pain. Blood spurted from his mouth. The remaining organs inside seemed to shrink from such an attack. Something seemed to burst inside. The hell beast flew right into the next room, and glared at the guy standing in the hole that had caused him such seemingly painful harm. Who would have even considered that he was that strong? The mutant landed right on the floor covered in water. There were human skulls all around, apparently the ones the experiment had gone wrong with. And now he looked at his until recently opponent, and realized that the change in his appearance was such for a reason. The hair was like red flaming feathers, sharp teeth, either a stone or bone outgrowth on his back, long claws, and armor like the setting sun. Chelu now recognized the guy's true power. He had seen it in the files, and it was terrifying, for he knows what this mutant is capable of. And here he is standing across the room enraged. It was now clear that Lu Renjia was one of the 9 platinum-level awakened ones from the Dragon City of Truth, and his name was Crimson Shura. And now the guy speculated about the fact that since Chelu was reading these confusing documents so freely, and he should definitely see a psychologist now. And the doctor started panicking and screaming that he didn't know anything, asking not to kill him. He wants to live, except he doesn't seem to realize yet that he won't get a normal life anyway. Lu Renjia tried once again to convince the guy that if he didn't believe then that he could save him, maybe he will now, except that in return the guy wants to hear the answer to the question. And it all depends on whether the monster answers. And the doctor, well, or rather once a doctor, didn't understand why he was seriously taking so long to think about it, so let him ask faster. The issue was that some time ago, a batch of packages sent to the Fish City base by the escort agency called Dragon Gate disappeared. The convoys that were on duty also disappeared one by one. So the thing that needs to be answered is whether he knows anything about this incident, and don't let him try to lie. Except the man didn't understand what this was all about, how a minor character like him could have access to such information, showing all the panic of what was going on. And now Lu Renjia was surprised at this answer, now wondering if the incident had anything at all to do with the organization the doctor was a member of, and the latter replied that he seemed to have read reports about it. The documents and information provided to her by the organization were stored in that warehouse. He pointed with his hand. The doctor didn't have time to read all of them, but if you pore through the documents you might find something interesting. And while Lu Renjia was looking towards that place, a huge hand appeared behind his back, reaching out to the little hero whose attentiveness was muted. The guy turned to late to his opponent, who only decided to pretend for a while that they had resolved all conflicts between them. This was a real chance for Chelu, which he didn't risk not taking this moment to attack. The huge boogeyman that was consuming everything had already gathered a bunch of human remains and swelled up like a huge heart, crushing such a strong hero who was to know Ivan fell for such a trick. Crimson Shura hadn't shown his face in a year, and yet he had revealed his true identity in front of the infernal beast, and in doing so, he probably thought that the monster would believe this nonsense about preserving his life, as if he was that stupid. And he's not sick, as his enemy just called him. His current state is the future of humanity, at least in his opinion. Right now, he had imperceptibly merged with the pet that his master had given him. Chelu was as much as possible riding on this person. Now he had so many abilities, he could feel an incredible power flowing through his body, and if he continued to merge, he would become a god of this world. This was exactly what was in his dreams and reveries. But was suddenly shocked to hear the courier's voice from the palm of his hand asking to be allowed to correct him, quite unexpectedly. He noticed all of this, except he didn't care about any of that, absolutely didn't care. He cut through the flesh that held him back. He was back in his powerful form, and his eyes glowing with rage. He was incredibly amused by what Infernal had just said about his position in the world as a god. Something this god couldn't even handle one of the platinum rank. The guy was burning up as he transformed into his human form, but it wasn't scary for him at all. And judging by what the mutant had just said, the courier was right when he said he needed to see a psychologist. Since the disaster began, the magnificent human civilization turned into ruins overnight. People have suffered for hundreds of years. The mistress lay in the middle of the ransacked room on the floor, covered by her courier's jacket. The strong preyed on the weak, virtue collapsed, and humanity grew weak. Just like right now, the weak one was Yurong, who still hadn't come to her senses. And only the quiet man, the true savior of this world, that's what the crazy people who didn't understand everything thought. Lu Renjia was standing at the door, and that one asked for a password if anyone wanted to know more, which seemed like a joke, but the guy was trying to pick the right one. The password was wrong and the system was now locked, and the guy stood in the middle of the archives. He didn't realize what the method was with the recording. He was thankful that he was now in trouble. But the courier was determined to see what he could find. It was interesting to find certain documents, and then, opening one drawer, thought, isn't this where the formula the doctor mentioned is, so he will take some for Miss Yurong. And then I looked closer and it was just aspirin, a fever medicine, but he should take some anyway, and then looked away, toward the balcony. It turned out to be a regular diary, and everything written is simple rumblings and ramblings. And then found one entertaining information. After the disaster was about escorts on the border. The organization decided to raid the escort group on the border to capture high-quality experimental facilities. 2 of the escorts from the base of truth of the Dragon City almost foiled their operation. The identities of these 2 are confidential, so the organization decides to put them into a deep sleep. Such a finding Lu Renjia was shocked by. 1 year ago, in the town in question, a young gentleman was about to go against all requests to wait and stay, spitting on all the locks. The guy just scattered all the subordinates, decided to use physical force since they don't understand words. He huffed and asked how he could calm down, adding that he was already calm. And then he asked with particular anger who had told them to keep him here, and they had better tell the truth, and by no means withhold anything. The people around him tried to calm the young gentleman down. He wanted to switch to a normal tone, but he failed. The boy aimed straight at the man with all the anger he could muster, intending to do harm, for he had asked a specific question to which he had never received an answer. But thanks to some sneaky man's magic, the guy didn't manage to attack the man. He landed on the empty ground. It hurt a little, not as critical, but anger only started to take over more. He called the old man a bastard. It was Master Huan, and he was the one who ordered the apprehension of the unusual fellow who confessed to it personally. And now Lu Renjia realized that the man had known everything from the beginning. The old man replied that Uncle Mo and Aunt Huan were leading the escort group this time, and he knows about it. They raised the guy, and they have a close relationship with the young hot-gut kid. Of course he's in the know about it too, but the courier didn't understand why things were unfolding the way they were. They were gold-level escorts. The Dragon Gate escort agency always had strong people, yet they still raided them. And after that, no one saw them. And now the question for this angry gentleman is, what can he find if he goes there right now? Now Lu Renjia had a question too. He was clarifying what the old man meant to say, that they should start an undercover investigation. But he got no instant reply, only doubt that he had calmed down and his ardor had cooled, so let him come to the base a little later. He thought back on it all and had an epiphany right on the spot. The old man was right then. They hadn't met any demonic beasts. This was most likely their group. He was worried about his uncle and aunt. He intends to avenge them very soon. That was his main goal. He couldn't just leave it at that. But here was just a personal failure. All the clues broke off, simply because there was no more mention of that incident. He didn't even write down the location. But then a familiar voice was heard from outside, calling out to Dr. Che, asking if he was here. Just like that, the muffling of a motorcycle was heard. And now it was clear who had just arrived. It was Sunan. He thought it was strange that no one was answering, looking as good as new. Sakinen checked the note once more, the one with the address on it, and in theory should have been correct, except that something about it was very little believable. The guy looked once more at the note and what was in front of him, and then once more at the piece of paper. Something didn't seem right to him, and understandably, in front of him was a dilapidated building that was partially on fire. It didn't seem to be the same place that was in the task description. For some reason, it didn't occur to Sunyan that right now something could be going on there. Escort wondered if there were people in a place like this, more like a demonic beast resided here, but there was nothing to do. The guy took a step forward, cautiously and quietly, but as soon as the guy got inside he stopped being quiet. He was loudly asking if anyone was here, figuring that if he called on the wrong person, he had a rifle behind his back in case he did. Except there was already someone else behind him as well. He responded to Sahinan's shout. It was Lu Renjia, who suddenly jumped out and stunned the guy in front of him with a fist strike to the head. Sahinan opened his eyes somewhat. It was hard to think. His head was buzzing. He did admit that it was painful after all. But this time too, the escort was wrapped absolutely completely and hung upside down from the ceiling by his feet. Sunan was screaming, asking for someone to help him, to save him. And to his captor he promised to give his captor everything he had. And the other escort ordered him to shut up, and asked why it was this guy again. It was only now that the glasses-clad escort realized who was in front of him, and decided that it would make the conversation easier, asking him not to kill him, assuring him that there was nothing to worry about. He hadn't told anyone about Lu Renjia and kept everything a secret. With a sly face, Shinon asked if he could, after such nuances, asked to be let go. But the interlocutor was not very simple, and said to take his time and answer a few questions, the first of which was why the old acquaintance was suddenly here. And the bound victim replied that of course he was in the shipping business. He had gotten a very generous offer on the black market, and now, after confessing, demanded to finally let him go. Lu Renjia, on the other hand, ignored this and decided to look at what was in the bag, the so-called export. In his hands were several magazines of highly questionable erotic content, a rather odd order. This was something that the guy who had caught the silver-level courier hadn't expected, and he was even stunned for a moment. He thought that there was something really important in there, and Shinon began to sway from side to side, trying to prove that it was his very important data. Lu Renjia almost laughed at such a statement, opened one of the magazines, began to look through, noticed how suspicious it was, and so the guy intended to take it for his so-called research, and he didn't care that the escort in glasses had spent a lot of money on it. The Black Iron Man made an intimidating psycho face and reiterated that this was something that needed to be studied very well, and Sinan said that he would even give the address where these materials could be found, just to let him go. And then Mr. Lu said that this was very good news for him, and the interlocutor only laughed nervously. And then a machine that looked like a walkie-talkie, only with a huge button, appeared in the escort's hands. And now Shinon didn't understand why he had come all the way here, if it was for this, and with only one button. And then Lu Renjia had questions about whether the guy had already pressed the button, which was very important, and the guy replied that of course not, he was a professional courier. And what if it exploded after pressing it? No one could know for sure. But the one who had roped Sunan upside down decided to test the button's functionality in practice, even though it was a huge risk. The courier with glasses was stunned by such levity, so much so that he asked to forget what he had said. But Mr. Lu advised that no one had ever answered him on the other side of the device. That suddenly a voice came from the walkie-talkie. It was hard to tell the owner from the radio waves, but it was good that there was at least some progress. On here side the persona inquired if the doctor could hear well, and after asking if the experiment was complete, the escorts were silent, absorbed in this conversation and wondering what to do next. And of course, nothing better than pretending to be a doctor came into the minds of the two guys. Lu Renjia replied that he could hear, and the voice of the unknown still demanded a report on the experiment, and then it was Sehunen's turn. Adjusting his voice, the bespectacled man confidently stated that of course the experiment had been successful. He felt that right now there was no one more convincing than him. And then the voice on the other side of the radio became silent. It became very disturbing. It seems that the pretense failed and the actors with the courier is quite bad. And then the silence ended. The person who had spoken to them replied that she remembered the voices of the person who had just spoken, and said goodbye very quickly. The deceivers unable to believe that in their own opinion, ingenious plan had failed. Mr. Lu became furious. He began to shout into the radio, even though no one could hear him, asking why he hung up the phone, if he was afraid, began to shout and call him a coward, demanded to call again. Now, and Shinon could not understand who it was, what could know his voice. And then horror struck them. It seemed as if the thing in their hands began to smoke. The walkie-talkie literally glowed and lit up in Lu Renjia's hands, beginning to blind his eyes. A huge explosion. Now there was nothing left of the building. Debris flying apart, dust rising into the air. A wave swept through the neighborhood. Sinan was right when he said that this thing could explode, but who expected such a thing after it turned out to be an ordinary walkie-talkie? Lu Renjia managed to transform into his superhuman form and picked up the guy bound by himself under one arm and Yurong under the other. He was curious about who this person was that blew up this hospital right away, while Sungun was worried about the fact that he had been carrying such a dangerous thing with him all this time. Escort asked another if he had seen the customer's face when he took the mission, to which he received the reply that dealers usually hide their faces, so he didn't know who it was, except he caught a glimpse of one peculiarity. His customer later made a buzzing sound, and this person being discussed was now standing in a gloomy ruined place. The unknown man stood in a hood and gas mask, making it impossible to identify him in any way. He felt sorry for such a waste of time. The doctor had been detected. Only wasted time. The little girl sat in her rags, huddled together, wishing she could see someone to get the slightest help. She remembered her mom and dad. She turned to them. She was too hungry. She didn't know what to do, where to go, where to look for help. The man stood over the girl and felt sorry that this child's parents had been eaten by monsters and now it was a round orphan. He slipped a piece of bread for the child to eat and at least get some strength from somewhere. And now he noticed that this child was very beautiful and advised to eat well. But the girl no longer heard these words. She stuffed her mouth with a piece of bread, filling her small stomach. The man angrily said he was looking forward to the child growing up faster. Now then she would repay him well as soon as she could. And as soon as the girl grew older, she was already trying to get away from the monsters, asking her uncle not to do that. She didn't understand what he wanted. And then her hand became terribly hot, and the fire began to burn through her already tattered clothes. Her fingers becoming lava-like in color. Soon she became a fire monster, but she couldn't understand what had happened to her. Everything was on fire. Those who wanted to harm her were tormented with burns on their bodies. Chaos was going on. Yurong didn't understand what was wrong with her, blaming the fact that she wasn't like everyone else, thinking about the circumstances under which this would never have happened. The doctor, like a huge monster, tried to take the girl in his hands, convincing her that she was sick, and only he could help her, and she believed. The girl was ready to do anything, even to just give up her ability, just to come to a normal life. Yurong was already in the hands of the evil scientist. Her power was about to cease to belong to her, and it seemed like there would be no more problems, but it was clear that there was a catch, and the catch was life-threatening. And then the girl refused such an offer, and sent to hell the man who had managed to deceive her, but she couldn't do anything else. Fear sparked in her eyes. Just because she couldn't resist somehow didn't mean someone else couldn't. And here came the fist of her courier, someone willing to protect people, much less her customers. He made sure that Chelu shattered into small pieces from the impact and let go of the innocent girl. Her head separated from her body, as did her arms, which were the ones holding the hostage. So Yurong opened her eyes. She was covered in sweat from terror. She also had Lu Renjia's jacket hanging on her. She didn't realize where she was. The three of them rode on Sunmin's motorcycle. The girl's courier was sitting behind, and he was the one she couldn't see. The guy with glasses noticed that Yurong had woken up and carefully asked how she was feeling. He saw that it wasn't important, but politeness had to remain. The girl was startled. She did not know who was before her, and immediately asked where her escort was, to which she was immediately answered that Mr. Lu was behind with a book. The guy immediately turned around as soon as he heard he was being sought after. He was too engrossed in what was in his hands and somehow pretended it wasn't a big deal, but immediately expressed that he was very happy that when Yurong woke up, she had no fever, which meant that this medicine was working very well. The girl exhaled with relief that the psycho wouldn't bother her anymore and she could go on with her life without fear. But then she finally noticed one small nuance and her face change, an emotion of some kind of disgust and disappointment. She immediately saw that she was reading Lu Renjia, also with such a nonchalant expression on her face. They were explicit pictures of a pornographic nature. But the guy only said that it was just an educational literature and didn't show that anything was wrong. And now Yurong was angry that they were making a fool of her and joking so unfunny, as if she were blind and couldn't see anything. Sunan stopped this almost conflict by advising the master to put away this so-called literature because they would be approaching the city very soon. The vehicle was already closer and closer to the huge walls and about to arrive at their destination, but only they had worries about being in the wrong direction. They stopped at a small alleyway, with houses a few stories high and small apartments. The streets were quiet and you couldn't tell it was a city. Lu Renjia plopped down on the soft bed and stretched. He was enjoying this moment. It was like his back had gone to heaven and was now nestled right on a fluffy cloud. And then the guy got up and looked at Sunan, who was not happy because he was obviously sleeping on his couch at home, and now he wanted to enjoy himself. The delivery guy had already given him his bed, so he didn't understand what he wanted. And that bed was the tampered bedding that lay on the floor. The mattress was thinner than toasted bread, and a tattered pillow that had already been knocked over. But Yurong couldn't watch this argument going on and got up from her bed and offered a compromise, which was that she could sleep there. She wasn't used to it, but Soongun couldn't allow that for a girl. He immediately blushed and started to say that it was okay. He was honored to have Miss Yurong on his bed. And the other guy replied that the girl shouldn't pay attention to this courier with glasses. He would send her somewhere tomorrow morning. By then there was still a long way to go, and waved his hand. And when the girl inquired where they would go, she only received in reply a riddle that there was someone who could help the young maiden. Yurong blushed. She was embarrassed and a little scared, so she asked Lu Renjia if he would help her and go along with her. But the guy refused her without a drop of awkwardness and discomfort, saying that he had other things to do, and he would not be able to keep track of the girl forever, and then tried to reassure her that there were kind and good people there. Yurong smiled lightly. It was clear to her now, although it wasn't very pleasant to hear such a thing, but she had to accept such a thing. The girl recognized that the guy is right, because she can't live like this forever. All her life, you have to get out of this state, and get out of her snail shell, in which she hides from the outside world. Morning came. The ruined ramshackle houses with boarded-up windows stood quietly in the middle of the sunny street, an incomprehensible situation hanging over the house. The bed Yurong was sleeping on was missing, just gone in the middle of the night. No one even noticed it. It was very strange and completely unexpected. There was a note on the bed, which evidently said something, so the boys hurriedly took it and read it as the girl explained it. But it was just a promissory note. It said that they would soon reimburse the ransom, because Lu Renjia realized that it was a mercenary king and he probably wanted him to chase after Yurong. But as such there was no need for that. You just need to find a particularly high spot somewhere nearby and climb up there. And when Lu Renjia climbed out, the data from the intelligence was confirmed. They found the girl he mentioned. The guy was happy about that to Ryu. He reminded that she stood out from the surroundings, so he ordered to keep an eye on her. He was notified by radio that the man had followed her, and then asked about getting her to the base. Lu Renjia only looked in the direction where Yurong had been seen and tried to ponder over what would actually be the right thing to do next, and gave a negative answer, saying let her do what she wants and do as she sees fit. Just need to follow her and not draw attention. The voice from the walkie-talkie took the order, and now decided to talk about something else. Officials buying scientific equipment on a large scale. There are no eyewitness reports of people wearing gas masks anywhere. His actions must be very secretive and they don't want to make a big deal of it. Hearing this, the courier promised to keep following up, and only Lu Renjia wanted to say goodbye and talk about getting in touch later, as his interlocutor asked him to hold off. He was asked about the fact that he had given Yurong gave her his coat, and now they had the weight of guessing about their relationship. It knocked the guy out. But this time the voice had already definitely said goodbye. It was only now that Lu Renjia noticed what was missing on him. He became upset, and the Shinon behind him became indignant. He didn't understand how such a detail could have been overlooked from the start. Even though the courier with glasses was afraid of heights, he still climbed up, and Lu Renjia finally acknowledged that the guy should go with him. And the interlocutor replied that it was his acquaintance who insisted on letting him talk, which made them his target, and then said that he would definitely go with the escort because it was safe with him. And Sunan also complimented by saying that he knows his secret, and Lu Renjia asked about if it was a threat, and then reminded him that the glasses-wearing arrogant guy already knew what happened to the last person who revealed his identity, Dr. Cheli, so it wasn't an option to say something like that to him. And Shinon replied that he didn't care. He wasn't going to let his interlocutor leave him behind anyway. Lu Renjia replied that it was up to the guy himself, and if he so desired, let him just follow him. The courier was intent on buying new clothes. In the store, they were welcomed warmly and told to ask about everything that interests boldly. Do not be shy. Lu Renjia wanted to pick up a coat, and one such one swept up. It was very similar to the old one. It was worth just picking such one. But here's the trouble, he couldn't find the price tag, and when he did dig it up, he was just shocked. It was too expensive. As for the stitched fabric, he almost screamed at the whole store. Immediately the guy started going through his pockets in an attempt to see what he even had with him. All he managed to dig up was 2 coins, and that was the real horror. He wouldn't be able to buy anything with it. He clenched what was left into a fist and resigned himself to the idea that he was completely bankrupt. though it was indeed hard to admit it. Lu Renjia just stood in the middle of the store in front of his queue and thought about the fact that he was hungry enough already. And what to do now? Where would he find the money to pay everything off? And he suddenly had a brilliant idea that he was going to implement very quickly. He looked at Sunnan, and the latter didn't understand what this was even about, but he still couldn't refuse normally. Lu Renjia was already walking and chewing his food. It hadn't been that long, it seemed. He was satisfied because he could properly fill his stomach with delicious food. So without anger, he asked his spontaneous partner about who told him to always keep an eye on him. And Sungun wondered in return how, with Mr. Lu being a bodyguard, and yet he could be so poor. And the hungry courier replied that he didn't want to rant about it, because they would refund the money from the next escort anyway. The guy with glasses said that they would forget about it for the time being and added that there were many more silver-level escorts. With Lu Renjia's power, wanted to say something but his interlocutor wouldn't let him. The courier was surprised and asked if the silver-level escort needed to be so good. To real black iron hair makes it feel so thin. Lu Renjia said that he was originally a black-haired man, and Tudu Shinan offered to cooperate. He just happened to see a silver-level mission that was very lucrative recently. He tried to convince that with his personality and Lu Renjia's strength, it would be very easy to do so. And as it turned out, the task was the same escort they were doing. They need to escort a dangerous man. It was a girl who was now sitting in a dungeon, chained, but was well aware that very soon would be able to leave this place.